In the quiet town of Cedar Falls, where neighbors still wave from their porches and children ride bicycles down tree-lined streets, Wes Calder thought he understood the boundaries of his simple life. A widowed mechanic raising his 8-year-old daughter Bee, he'd grown accustomed to the gentle rhythm of small-town existence. Saturday morning pancakes, evening sign language lessons that honored his late wife's memory, and the comforting predictability of routine. Then came the silent girl at the park, watching from behind the swings with eyes that held secrets too heavy for someone so young. What began as a weekend favor to overwhelmed social services would transform into something neither Wes nor his daughter could have imagined. But when a billionaire's desperate search collides with a mechanic's quiet act of kindness, the question emerges: can love transcend the vast distances between two very different worlds? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the maple trees lining Elm Street, casting dancing shadows across the modest front yard where Wes Calder knelt beside his pickup truck, wrench in hand. The familiar weight of the tool felt right in his calloused palm, a sensation that grounded him in the present moment, away from the memories that sometimes threatened to pull him under. At 38, Wes carried himself with the quiet strength of a man who'd learned to shoulder burdens without complaint. His broad shoulders testament to years of honest work, and his weathered hands speaking of countless repairs, both mechanical and emotional. "Dad, you promised we'd practice before school," came a voice from the front porch, clear and bright as morning bells. Bee Calder, 8 years old, with her mother's curious green eyes and her father's stubborn chin, stood framed in the doorway. Her school backpack slung over one shoulder, and her expression mixing impatience with affection. Wes looked up from the engine bay, his face softening into the kind of smile reserved exclusively for his daughter. "5 more minutes, sweetheart. This old girl's been making some concerning noises, and Mrs. Henderson needs her car back this afternoon." Bee approached with the confident stride of a child who knew her place in her father's world was secure and central. She peered into the truck's engine compartment with genuine interest, her small hands mimicking her father's movements as he adjusted a belt. "What kind of noises?" "Like a cat with a sore throat," Wes replied, his tone serious but his eyes twinkling. "Sometimes these engines just need someone to listen to what they're trying to say. Like Mom used to say about people," Bee observed, her hands moving fluidly as she signed the words alongside speaking them. The gesture was as natural as breathing, a bilingual dance that kept Sarah Calder's presence alive in their daily routines. The mention of Sarah brought that familiar tightness to Wes's chest, not the sharp pain of fresh grief that had once threatened to overwhelm him, but the gentler ache of cherished memory. Sarah had been Cedar Falls' only certified ASL interpreter, working with the county school system and volunteering at the regional deaf community center. Her passion for bridging communication gaps had been infectious, and she'd insisted on teaching both Wes and Bee to sign from the time their daughter was old enough to wave her tiny fists. On the passenger seat of his truck lay Sarah's old ASL dictionary, its pages worn soft from years of use, margins filled with her handwritten notes and observations. Wes carried it everywhere, though he rarely needed to reference it anymore. The book had become a talisman, a physical connection to the woman who taught him that communication was about so much more than words. "Exactly like Mom used to say," Wes confirmed, closing the hood with a satisfying thud. He wiped his hands on the red shop rag that perpetually hung from his back pocket, then turned his full attention to his daughter. "Now, what did you want? To practice?" Bee's face lit up with the particular joy that came from having her father's undivided attention. She launched into the poem she'd been working on for her 3rd grade presentation, her hands moving gracefully through the signs, while her voice carried the careful cadence of someone learning to marry 2 languages into one expression. The poem was about autumn leaves, simple enough for her age, but infused with the kind of observational detail that reminded Wes daily of Sarah's influence. As Bee signed, Wes found himself transported back 3 years to Sarah's final autumn. She'd been diagnosed with the aggressive brain tumor in August, gone by November, a time frame so compressed that grief felt like whiplash. But in those golden September days, when the diagnosis was still fresh and hope still flickered, Sarah had spent hours in their backyard with Bee, teaching her to describe the changing leaves in sign language. "The beauty isn't just in what we see," Sarah had said, her own hands moving with the practiced elegance of a native signer, "but in how we choose to share it with others." "Perfect," Wes said, as Bee concluded her presentation, and he meant it. Her signing had grown more nuanced over the past year, developing the kind of natural rhythm that couldn't be taught, only cultivated through consistent practice and emotional connection. The walk to Cedar Falls Elementary took them down familiar streets lined with houses that held the comfortable patina of decades. Mrs. Kowalski waved from her garden where she was collecting the last tomatoes of the season. Mr. Chen, who ran the corner market, called out a greeting from where he was arranging pumpkins in front of his store. These interactions, brief but genuine, formed the fabric of their community, threads of connection that had supported Wes and Bee through their darkest months. Cedar Falls was the kind of place where people still left their doors unlocked and knew their neighbors' middle names. When Sarah had died, casseroles had appeared on their doorstep for weeks, each one accompanied by a handwritten note, and the quiet understanding that grief required both solitude and community support. Wes had learned to accept help gracefully, recognizing that his neighbors' offerings were as much about their own need to contribute as they were about his family's need for sustenance. "Will you pick me up today, or am I taking the bus?" Bee asked, as they approached the school's front entrance, where children were streaming in with the chaotic energy of youth meeting structure. "I'll be here at 3:15, Wes promised, adjusting her backpack straps with the practiced efficiency of single parenthood. "And maybe we'll stop by the park afterward if you finish your homework quickly." Bee's eyes brightened at the prospect. Cedar Falls Park was their special place, where they'd often gone with Sarah for weekend picnics, and where Wes now took his daughter when life felt too confined by routine. The park held memories both painful and precious, Sarah's laughter echoing. From the pavilion where they'd celebrated Bee's 5th birthday, the bench where they'd sat together during those final weeks, talking about the future in whispers that tried to hold hope and fear in equal measure. After Bee disappeared into the school building with a final wave, Wes walked back through town toward Calder's Auto Repair, the small shop he'd inherited from his father and transformed into his own vision of honest work and fair dealing. The transition from teaching to mechanics hadn't been planned. It had been necessity born from Sarah's medical bills and the need for a more flexible schedule during her illness. But he'd discovered a satisfaction in the work that surprised him, finding comfort in problems that had concrete solutions and grateful customers who appreciated expertise delivered without pretension. The shop occupied a corner lot on Main Street, its red brick facade weathered but dignified, with large windows that allowed natural light to flood the work area. A hand-painted sign, touched up each spring, announced Calder's Auto Repair, 3 generations of service, in letters that managed to be both practical and proud. Inside, the walls were lined with tools that had been passed down from his grandfather, their handles worn smooth by decades of use. Tommy Rodriguez, his part-time assistant and a recent high school graduate, was already bent under the hood of a Ford Explorer, his enthusiasm for automotive mysteries making up for his still-developing technical skills. Rita Kowalski's ancient Buick occupied the second bay, awaiting the brakework that Wes had promised to complete before her weekly grocery run. "Morning, boss," Tommy called out, his voice slightly muffled by the engine compartment. "That noise. In Mrs. Henderson's truck. I think I figured out what you were hearing," Wes poured himself coffee from the pot that Rita had brought along with her car, a gesture typical of Cedar Falls, where business relationships often blurred into friendship. The coffee was strong and honest, much like the woman who'd made it. "What's your diagnosis, Dr. Rodriguez?" Tommy emerged from under the hood, a streak of grease across his forehead and a grin that suggested pride in discovery. "Serpentine belts. Starting to fray, but there's also some play in the tensioner pulley. Replace both and she'll purr like she's supposed to." "Good catch," Wes said, and meant it. Tommy's mechanical intuition was developing well, and Wes took quiet satisfaction in passing along the knowledge his own father had shared decades earlier. Teaching had always come naturally to him, whether in the elementary school classroom, where he'd worked before Sarah's illness forced a career change, or here in the shop, where problems had concrete solutions and honest work yielded visible results. The morning passed in the comfortable rhythm of familiar work. Wes completed Mrs. Henderson's repair, guided Tommy through the brake job on Rita's Buick, and fielded a steady stream of phone calls from customers whose automotive troubles ranged from routine maintenance to mysterious rattles that defied easy diagnosis. This was the life he'd built after Sarah's death, predictable, stable, centered around Bee's needs and their shared routines. At lunch, Wes drove to the elementary school to volunteer in the cafeteria, a commitment he'd maintained since the previous spring, when the school administration had reached out to parents for additional support. The work was simple, helping younger children open milk cartons, mediating minor lunchtime disputes, wiping down tables. But it allowed him to glimpse Bee's world and to contribute to the community that had embraced them both. Today, however, something felt different. As Wes moved through the cafeteria, he noticed clusters of teachers engaged in hushed conversations, their expressions carrying the particular tension that accompanied serious news. Mrs. Patterson, the principal, seemed distracted during their usual brief exchange about Bee's progress, and several parents who'd arrived for pickup duty appeared unusually solemn. It wasn't until he was walking back to his truck that Wes encountered Janet Morrison, whose daughter was in Bee's class and whose husband worked as a county social worker. Janet's usually cheerful demeanor had been replaced by something more guarded, more concerned. "Wes," she called out, her voice carrying an odd formality. "I wanted to mention there's been some unusual activity around town today. County vehicles, some out-of-state plates. David thinks it might be related to that missing child case that's been in the news." Wes paused, his hand on the truck's door handle. He'd been vaguely aware of the story. A wealthy family's daughter who disappeared under mysterious circumstances somewhere downstate, but the details had seemed remote from his daily concerns. "Here in Cedar Falls? David's not supposed to discuss ongoing cases," Janet continued, her tone suggesting she was sharing information despite official protocols. "But he's concerned they might be expanding the search area. I just thought you should know in case Bee hears rumors at school." The afternoon felt different after that conversation, though Wes couldn't quite articulate why. As he returned to the shop, he found himself more aware of the vehicles passing. On Main Street, more attuned to the subtle changes in the town's usual rhythms. Tommy noticed his distraction, but didn't comment, a discretion that Wes appreciated. When 3:15 arrived, Wes was waiting in the school pickup lane 5 minutes early, watching as children streamed out of the building with the explosive energy of freedom. Bee appeared among them, her backpack bouncing against her hip as she scanned the line of waiting vehicles. Her face brightened when she spotted his truck, and she jogged over with the unself-conscious enthusiasm that still characterized her interactions with the world. "How was school?" Wes asked as she climbed into the passenger seat, buckling her seatbelt with practiced efficiency. "Good," she replied, then launched into a detailed account of her day that included a science experiment involving baking soda, volcanoes, a playground dispute resolved through careful diplomacy, and a book report assignment that had her excited about visiting the library. Her chatter filled the truck's cab with warmth and life, pushing away the vague unease that had settled over Wes during the afternoon. "Can we go to the park now?" Bea asked, as they pulled away from the school. "I finished my math worksheet during study hall, and I only have reading left for homework." The park was a short drive from the school, nestled between the residential neighborhood where they lived and the commercial district that housed Wes's shop. Cedar Falls Park had been designed with families in mind. Playground equipment suitable for various ages, walking paths that wound through stands of mature oak and maple trees, pavilions available for community gatherings, and a small pond that attracted ducks and the occasional great blue heron. As they pulled into the parking area, Wes noticed they weren't alone. A dark sedan sat in the far corner of the lot, its occupants visible as silhouettes behind tinted windows. The sight triggered a vague sense of unease, though he couldn't pinpoint why. Cedar Falls wasn't the kind of place where unfamiliar vehicles aroused immediate suspicion, but something about the sedan's positioning and the way its occupants seemed to be observing rather than participating felt out of place. Bea, however, was oblivious to her father's concerns. She bounded toward the playground with the single-minded enthusiasm of childhood, calling back over her shoulder, "Push me on the swings when you're ready." Wes followed more slowly, his attention divided between his daughter's joyful exploration and the subtle wrongness he sensed in the park's atmosphere. The afternoon sun slanted through the trees at the perfect autumn angle, painting everything in golden light that should have felt peaceful and welcoming. Instead, he found himself scanning the area with the heightened awareness of someone who'd learned that safety was never guaranteed. It was then that he saw her, a small figure tucked behind the swing set's support structure, partially hidden by the metal framework and the shadows it cast. A child, maybe 6 or 7 years old, wearing clothes that looked like they'd seen several days without washing. Her dark hair hung in tangles around a face that was dirt-smudged, but not entirely obscured, and her eyes, those eyes, held something that made Wes's chest tighten with recognition and concern. The girl wasn't playing or exploring like children typically did in parks. She was watching, her gaze fixed on Bea with an intensity that spoke of longing rather than casual interest. When Wes moved slightly to get a better view, the child immediately shrank deeper into the shadows, her body language screaming of wariness and fear. "Bea," Wes called softly, his voice carrying the particular tone that his daughter had learned meant pay attention without alarm. "Come here for a moment." Bea looked up from the monkey bars she'd been testing, her expression curious but not concerned. She approached with the easy confidence of a child who'd never had reason to fear her father's sudden requests for attention. "There's a little girl over by the swings," Wes said quietly, crouching to Bea's eye level. "She seems scared and alone. I'm going to see if she needs help, but I want you to stay where I can see you, okay?" Bea nodded solemnly, her green eyes reflecting the same compassionate instinct that had characterized her mother. "Is she lost?" "I'm not sure yet," Wes replied. "But sometimes people need kindness even when we don't know their whole story." As Wes approached the swing set, he moved slowly and deliberately, his hands visible and his posture non-threatening. The girl had pressed herself further into the shadows, but her eyes tracked his movement with the hypervigilance of someone who'd learned to assess danger as a survival skill. The dark sedan in the parking lot seemed to loom larger in his peripheral vision, its presence taking on an ominous quality that made his protective instincts flare. "Hello," Wes said softly when he was still several feet away, crouching down, to make himself less imposing. "I'm Wes. That's my daughter Bea over there. Are you here with someone?" The girl didn't respond verbally, but her eyes darted toward the parking area where the sedan still sat. The movement was brief but telling, and Wes felt pieces of a puzzle beginning to shift in his mind, though the complete picture remained unclear. Her clothes were dirty but not torn, suggesting recent care followed by neglect. Most troubling were her hands. Despite her obvious fear and isolation, they moved in small, deliberate gestures that looked remarkably like fragmented sign language. "Can you sign?" Wes asked gently, his own hands moving through the question in ASL as he spoke. Do you know sign language? The transformation in the girl's face was immediate and profound. Her eyes widened, not with fear this time, but with something that looked like recognition and desperate hope. Her hands began to move more deliberately, forming shapes that Wes recognized as attempts at communication, though her signing was clearly limited and unpracticed. "I'm learning," she seemed to be saying, though her signs were slow and uncertain. "Please don't hurt me." The last part broke Wes's heart entirely. This child had been conditioned to expect harm, to approach every interaction with the assumption that pain might follow. But she was trying to communicate, reaching across the language barrier with the tools she possessed, trusting enough to reveal this piece of herself. "I won't hurt you," Wes signed back, his movements slow and clear. "I want to help. Are you lost? Do you need food?" The girl's response was immediate. An emphatic nod followed by signs that conveyed hunger, thirst, and a bone-deep tiredness that spoke of more than just physical exhaustion. But when Wes asked about her family, about where she belonged, her hands fell still, and that shuttered look returned to her eyes. From across the playground, Bee had been watching this exchange. With growing fascination and understanding, she approached slowly, her own hands moving in sign as she walked. "Dad's really good at signing," she said, and signed simultaneously, addressing the girl directly. "He taught me because my mum was deaf. Well, not deaf, but she worked with deaf people. Do you want to see my favorite sign?" Without waiting for permission, Bee performed the sign for friend, hands interlocked, then reversed, a gesture of mutual support and connection. The girl's response was immediate and heartbreaking. She attempted to copy the sign, her movements uncertain but earnest, and for the first time since Wes had noticed her, something like a smile ghosted across her features. It was then that Wes's phone rang, the sound cutting through the delicate tension of the moment. He glanced at the screen, Janet Morrison's number, and felt that sense of unease deepen into something approaching dread. "I need to take this," he told the girls, stepping a few feet away but keeping them in sight. "But I want both of you to stay right here, okay?" "Wes?" Janet's voice was tight with concern. "David just called. They're expanding the search to Cedar Falls. That missing girl, Emiline Vale. They have reason to believe she might be in our area. There are going to be police and federal agents and probably media arriving soon. David wanted to give you a heads up, since you volunteer at the school." Wes's gaze moved from his phone to the girl by the swings, who was now allowing Bee to show her how to pump her legs to make the swing move. The timing felt too coincidental, the pieces too aligned to be chance. 7 years old, dark hair, mute, and now here in Cedar Falls at the exact moment when authorities were expanding their search. "What does she look like?" he asked quietly. "This missing girl. 7 years old, dark hair, around 40 pounds. She's mute, some kind of trauma-related condition." "Wes, why are you asking?" The phone felt heavy in his hand as he watched the girl respond to Bee's patient instruction, her small hands gripping the swing's chains with white-knuckled intensity, while something like joy began to transform her features. "I think," Wes said carefully, "I might need David to come to the park, and Janet tell him to come alone and to come quietly. I think we might have found her." The silence that followed, stretched like a held breath, filled with the weight of recognition and the terrible responsibility that comes with sudden, life-altering knowledge. Across the playground, Bee was teaching the girl how to twist the swing's chains and spin. Their laughter carried on the autumn breeze, innocent and pure, unmarked by the storm that was about to descend on their quiet corner of the world. "Are you certain?" Janet's voice crackled through the phone, tight with the same disbelief that was coursing through Wes's veins. "Wes, if this is really her, if this is Emiline Vale, do you understand what this means?" He understood more than Janet realized. The dark sedan in the parking lot suddenly made terrible sense. Not random observers, but searchers who'd been tracking leads, following trails that had somehow led them to Cedar Falls. The girl's hypervigilance, her instinctive fear of adults, her desperate attempt to remain hidden while simultaneously craving the connection that Bee offered so naturally. All of it painted a picture that made Wes's chest tighten with protective fury. Through the phone, he could hear Janet relay information to someone in the background, presumably her husband David, whose role as a county social worker had just become infinitely more complicated. The administrative machinery was already beginning to turn, protocols activating that would transform this quiet moment into something much larger and more intrusive. "David's on his way," Janet said. "But Wes, you need to know. There are federal agents involved in this case. The FBI has been coordinating with state and local authorities. This isn't just a missing child case anymore. There are allegations of kidnapping, possibly worse. When they arrive, they're going to scare her," Wes interrupted, watching as Emiline attempted to sign something to Bee, her small hands moving with increasing confidence. "She's just started to trust us. If a bunch of strangers in suits show up and try to take her away, she's going to shut down completely." The reality of the situation was beginning to crystallize in his mind, like ice forming on a winter window, beautiful and terrible and impossible to ignore. This child, who'd appeared in their lives like a gift wrapped in mystery, was about to be reclaimed by a world that had already failed to protect her once. The billionaire father, the media attention, the legal complexities, all of it would descend on Cedar Falls like a hurricane, and at the center of the storm would be a 7-year-old girl who'd found a moment of peace in the simple act of learning to swing. 20 minutes, Janet said. "David will be there in 20 minutes. Try to keep her calm until then, and Wes, be careful. If those people in the sedan are who I think they are, this situation is about to become very complicated very quickly." The line went dead, leaving Wes alone with the magnitude of what was unfolding. 20 minutes to maintain the fragile peace that had settled over the playground. 20 minutes before the outside world intruded on this bubble of safety that Bee had created simply by offering friendship to a lonely child. He pocketed the phone and walked back toward the swings, his movements deliberate and calm, despite the urgency building in his chest. Emiline, he was certain now that's who she was, looked up as he approached, her expression alert but no longer fearful. In the span of half an hour, Bee's patient kindness had accomplished what weeks of professional intervention might have. "Struggled to achieve. Everything okay, Dad?" Bea asked, her intuition picking up on the subtle tension in his posture. She'd learned to read his moods with the precision that children develop when they're deeply connected to their primary caregiver, when their security depends on understanding the emotional weather of their small world. "Some people are coming to help," Wes said carefully, crouching down so he could address both girls at eye level. "Good people. People whose job it is to make sure children are safe. But they might seem a little scary at first because they don't know how to talk with their hands like we do." Emiline's face immediately transformed, the fragile trust she'd begun to show evaporating like morning mist. Her hands moved in rapid, desperate signs. "No, please, don't let them take me. I'll be good. I'll be quiet." A litany of promises that broke Wes's heart because they revealed so much about what she'd endured. "Hey," Bee said, reaching out to touch Emiline's arm with the gentle instinct of someone who'd inherited her mother's gift for comfort. "My dad doesn't let bad things happen. He's like a superhero, but with wrenches instead of a cape." "Despite everything," Emiline's mouth quirked into something that might have been a smile. She signed something that looked like a question, and Bee giggled. "She wants to know if you can fix cars and people," Bee translated. "I told her you're really good at both." A movement in his peripheral vision caught Wes's attention. The sedan's doors were opening, two figures emerging with the controlled movements of people accustomed to surveillance work. They didn't approach directly, but their positioning suggested coordination, professional observation. Emiline noticed them too, her body tensing like a small animal preparing to flee. "It's okay," Wes said, though he wasn't entirely sure it was true. "Nobody's going to hurt you, I promise." The weight of that promise settled on his shoulders like a physical burden. He'd made similar assurances to Bea during the worst days of Sarah's illness, commitments to protection and safety that had sometimes felt impossible to keep. But he'd kept them then, through sheer determination and the fierce love that parenthood demanded, and he would find a way to keep this one too. David Morrison's county vehicle pulled into the parking lot with deliberate casualness, the kind of official presence that tried not to look official. David himself was a man Wes had known peripherally for years, a steady, thoughtful professional whose work with vulnerable families had earned him respect throughout the community. If anyone could handle this situation with the delicacy it required, it would be David. But even David's careful approach couldn't prevent the fundamental disruption that his arrival represented. Emiline shrank back against the swing set's framework, her eyes darting between the approaching social worker and the two figures from the sedan who were now moving closer with professional determination. "Wes!" David called out softly as he approached, his hands visible and his movements deliberately slow. "I understand we might have a situation here. We have a little girl who's scared and hungry and has been through something terrible," Wes replied, positioning himself protectively between Emiline and the approaching adults. "She's just started to trust us. Whatever happens next, it needs to happen slowly and carefully." David nodded, his expression reflecting years of experience with traumatized children. But behind him, the two federal agents were approaching with less patience, their body language suggesting urgency that had little to do with Emiline's emotional state and everything to do with bureaucratic requirements and case closure. "Mr. Calder," one of the agents called out, his voice carrying the authority of federal law enforcement, "we need to ask you to step away from the child. We have reason to believe this is Emiline Vale, a missing person in an active federal investigation." Emiline's response was immediate and heartbreaking. She pressed herself against Wes's leg, her small hands clutching at his jacket while desperate signs poured from her fingers. "Don't let them take me. I want to stay with you. Please don't let them hurt me." Bea moved closer too, her 8-year-old instincts recognizing threat and responding with protective loyalty. "She doesn't want to go with them, Dad. She's scared." "I know, sweetheart," Wes said softly, his own hands moving in sign as he spoke. To Emiline, "Nobody's going to take you anywhere you don't want to go. We're going to figure this out together." But even as he made the promise, Wes knew he was speaking from hope rather than authority. The wheels of federal investigation had begun to turn, and a small-town mechanic's protective instincts carried little weight against the machinery of law enforcement and bureaucratic protocol. The quiet life he'd built with Bea was about to be shattered, and at the center of the storm was a 7-year-old girl who'd found safety in their simple kindness. The federal agents approached with the methodical precision of people accustomed to taking control of chaotic situations. But their efficiency only served to heighten Emiline's terror. She pressed herself harder against Wes's leg, her small body trembling as her hands moved in frantic signs that mixed English ASL with what appeared to be fragments of other communication systems she'd cobbled together during her weeks of isolation. "Please, everyone needs to slow down," David Morrison said, stepping forward with the diplomatic authority that came from years of mediating between traumatized children and well-meaning but impatient adults. "This child has clearly been through significant trauma. Any sudden movements or changes are going to be counterproductive." Agent Sarah Chen, the lead investigator, paused in her approach, though her partner continued to position himself strategically around the playground equipment. Chen had the kind of weathered competence that suggested extensive experience with missing children cases, but her eyes softened as she took in Emiline's obvious distress. "Mr. Calder," Chen said, her voice gentler than her initial authoritative tone, "I understand your protective instincts, but we need to establish this child's identity and ensure her immediate safety. Emiline Vale has been missing for 3 weeks. Her father has been frantic with worry." Her father, Wes repeated, the words carrying a weight of unspoken questions. Where was her father when someone took her? Where was all that security and protection when she needed it most? Bea looked up at her father with the keen intelligence of a child who'd learned to read adult subtext. Dad? She's signing that she doesn't want to see her father. She keeps saying, scary man and loud voices. The translation hung in the air like a challenge to everything the adults thought they understood about the situation. Chen's expression shifted from professional determination to something more complex, more troubled. She knelt down slowly, making herself less imposing as she addressed Emiline directly. "Hello, sweetheart," Chen said, her voice gentle but not condescending. "I'm Sarah. I've been looking for you for a long time. Can you tell me your name?" Emiline's response was to bury her face against Wes's jacket, her small hands clutching the fabric as if it were a lifeline. But after a moment she turned slightly, just enough to peer at Chen with one wary eye. Her hands moved hesitantly, forming the signs for M, and then, after a longer pause, scared. "That's okay," Chen said, maintaining her crouched position. "It's okay to be scared, but you're safe. Now, we just want to make sure you get the help you need." David Morrison had been quietly observing the interaction, his trained eye cataloguing the subtle signs of trauma that Emiline displayed. The hypervigilance, the startled responses to sudden movements, the way she positioned herself to maintain escape routes. His experience with abused and neglected children had taught him to read the stories that bodies told when words failed. "Agent Chen," David said quietly, "I think we need to consider emergency foster placement while we sort through the legal complexities. This child is clearly traumatized, and forcing immediate reunification could cause additional psychological harm." "Emergency placement?" Chen's partner, Agent Rodriguez, spoke for the first time, his tone suggesting bureaucratic impatience. "This isn't some random runaway. This is Emiline Vale, daughter of one of the wealthiest men in the state. Her father has resources, private medical care, the best child psychologists money can buy." "Money doesn't fix trauma," Wes said flatly, his protective instincts flaring at the dismissive tone, "and resources don't mean much if the child doesn't feel safe accessing them." As if to underscore his point, Emiline chose that moment to pull a crumpled napkin from her pocket and begin drawing on it with a stubby pencil she'd somehow acquired. Her movements were quick and furtive, as if she expected the drawing to be taken away at any moment. The image that emerged was crude, but unmistakably clear. Stick figures that seemed to show a large man with angry scribbles around his head, and a smaller figure cowering behind what might have been furniture. Bea leaned closer to look at the drawing, her expression growing troubled. "Em, is that your dad? The angry man?" Emiline's nod was barely perceptible, but it was enough to shift the entire dynamic of the conversation. Chen and David exchanged glances that carried the weight of professional experience with family dysfunction that money couldn't solve. "Mr. Calder," Chen said carefully, "I need to ask you to bring Emiline down to the county services building for a proper interview and medical evaluation. Standard protocol requires—" "No," the word came out more forcefully than Wes had intended, but he didn't retract it. "Look at her. She's terrified of authority figures. She's finally started to communicate, and you want to drag her into an institutional setting where she'll shut down completely?" "Dad's right," Bea added, her 8-year-old voice carrying surprising authority. "When I was scared after Mom died, the doctor's office made everything worse. Em needs somewhere safe, not somewhere official." David Morrison found himself in the uncomfortable position of mediating between federal authority and common-sense child psychology. His years of experience told him that Wes and Bea were right. Institutional settings could re-traumatize vulnerable children, but his professional obligations required adherence to established protocols. "What if we compromise?" David suggested. "Emergency foster placement with the Calders for tonight, with the county supervisor present, full medical and psychological evaluation tomorrow, but in a setting that feels safer for Emiline. Jen considered this, weighing bureaucratic requirements against the obvious reality of a traumatized child who'd finally found someone she trusted. Her partner looked less enthusiastic about deviating from standard procedure, but even Rodriguez seemed to recognize that forcing the issue would likely result in Emiline shutting down completely. Temporary placement, Chen agreed finally. 24 hours with county supervision and a federal liaison present. But Mr. Calder, you need to understand this is highly irregular. If anything goes wrong, if there are any concerns about the child's safety or well-being, nothing will go wrong, Wes said firmly. She'll be safe with us. The administrative machinery that followed was both swift and surreal. Homes were filled out on the playground picnic tables, while Emiline sat close to Bee, the two girls sharing crackers from Wes's emergency snack supply and communicating in the mixture of sign language and intuitive understanding that children seemed to develop effortlessly. Dr. Patricia Winters, the county child psychologist, arrived within an hour of David's phone call. She was a woman in her 60s, whose gentle demeanor and infinite patience had made her the go-to professional for traumatized children throughout the region. Her approach to Emiline was masterful, sitting at a distance, allowing the child to observe and acclimate, making no demands for immediate interaction. She's been through something significant, Dr. Winters observed quietly to the assembled adults. The hypervigilance, the regression in communication skills, the way she positions herself near exits, these are classic signs of complex trauma. Rushing her recovery could set back any progress indefinitely. The media had begun to arrive by early evening, news vans positioning themselves just outside the park boundaries, while reporters attempted to piece together the story from the scattered information available. Wes felt a chill of apprehension as he watched the circus beginning to assemble. His quiet life, Bee's normal childhood, the peaceful routines they'd built, all of it was about to be dissected by strangers with cameras and deadlines. "We need to get her somewhere private," Wes said to David, watching as Emiline noticed the gathering reporters and shrank closer to Bee. "This is exactly what she doesn't need right now." The drive to Wes's house felt like a strange procession, his truck leading the way with Bee and Emiline in the back seat, followed by David's county vehicle and Agent Chen's sedan. Behind them, the first news van attempted to follow, until Rodriguez positioned his vehicle to block their pursuit. Inside Wes's modest home, Emiline's behavior shifted again. She moved through the rooms like someone conducting a security assessment, checking exits and sightlines with the thoroughness of someone who'd learned to prioritize escape routes. But when she reached the living room and saw the family photos covering the mantel, pictures of Wes, Bee, and Sarah in happier times, her expression softened. She pointed to a photo of Sarah teaching Bee to sign, her small finger tracing the image of hands moving in communication. "Mama?" she signed, the question clear despite her limited vocabulary. "That was my mum," Bee explained, settling onto the couch and patting the cushion beside her in invitation. "She taught people how to talk with their hands. She would have really liked you." Dr. Winters observed this interaction with professional interest, noting how Emiline responded to the casual mention of loss and family complexity. The child's next drawing, executed on a napkin from Wes's kitchen table, showed stick figures that seemed to represent a family. But instead of the angry scribbles she'd drawn earlier, these figures had gentle curves and connecting lines between their hands. "She's processing," Dr. Winters murmured to the adults who were watching from the kitchen doorway. "For the first time in weeks, possibly months, she's in an environment where she feels safe enough to begin working through her trauma." The evening meal was a carefully orchestrated affair, with County Supervisor Janet Morrison joining the growing assemblage of officials who seemed determined to document every moment of Emiline's first night of safety. But despite the official presence, Something magical happened around Wes's dinner table. Emiline began to eat, not just the cautious nibbling of someone who expected food to be taken away, but the genuine hunger of a child who'd been genuinely starved for both nutrition and normalcy. Bia appointed herself as Emiline's translator and protector, explaining each dish in sign language and sharing stories about her father's cooking that made the smaller girl's eyes widen with something that might have been anticipation rather than fear. When Emiline laughed, a small, rusty sound like a machine learning to work again, the adults felt something shift in the room's atmosphere. "She hasn't laughed in the 3 weeks since she disappeared," Agent Chen said quietly, her professional composure cracking slightly. Her father said she used to laugh all the time before her mother died. The mention of Emiline's mother brought a new understanding to the evening's dynamics. This child had lost her primary attachment figure, been traumatized by her disappearance, and was now being asked to trust a world that had failed to protect her twice. That she was beginning to open up to Wes and Bea spoke to something deeper than simple rescue. It suggested a recognition of genuine safety, of people who understood loss and knew how to create space for healing. As the evening wore on, the official observers began to recognize that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Not just the discovery of a missing child, but the beginning of a healing process that couldn't be rushed or institutionalized. When Emiline fell asleep on the couch between Wes and Bea, her small hand still clutching one of her precious drawings, even Agent Rodriguez seemed to understand that forcing her removal would be an act of cruelty rather than bureaucratic efficiency. 24 hours, Chen reminded the room as she prepared to leave for the night. But I'm beginning to think this child's recovery is going to require more flexibility than our standard protocols typically allow. Outside, the media had given up their vigil for the night, but Wes knew they'd be back in the morning with more questions, more cameras, and more disruption to the fragile peace that had settled over his home. The real test would come tomorrow, when Emiline's father arrived and the legal complexities began to multiply. For tonight, though, a lost child was safe, and that felt like enough. The morning arrived with the rumble of expensive engines and the coordinated precision of wealth in motion. Wes woke to the sight of a convoy of black vehicles assembling outside his modest home, sleek sedans with tinted windows flanked by what appeared to be private security personnel whose posture suggested military training. At the center of the formation sat a Bentley that looked like it cost more than most Cedar Falls residents earned in several years. Emiline had awakened before dawn, her internal clock apparently tuned to hypervigilance rather than natural sleep cycles. She'd been sitting by the living room window when the vehicles arrived, her small body going rigid with recognition and terror. By the time Wes reached her side, she was signing frantically. "He found me. He found me. I have to hide," while tears streamed down her face. "You're safe," Bea said, rushing to her new friend's side with the fierce protectiveness that had characterized her personality since early childhood. "My dad won't let anyone hurt you, right, Dad?" Wes knelt beside both girls, his heart breaking at the fear in Emiline's eyes. Through the window, he could see a tall man emerging from the Bentley, Rowan Vale in person, looking every inch the billionaire philanthropist that media photos had suggested, but carrying himself with the tension of a man whose world had been shattered by loss and uncertainty. "That's your father," Wes said gently, his hands moving in sign as he spoke. "He's been looking for you because he was worried, but you don't have to do anything you're not ready for." Agent Chen's arrival added another layer of official complexity to the morning's drama. She entered Wes's home, followed by David Morrison, Dr. Winters, and a new face, Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, a pediatric trauma specialist whose reputation had apparently warranted her emergency consultation on the case. "Mr. Vale is requesting immediate access to his daughter," Chen informed the assembled group, her professional demeanor masking what Wes suspected was significant pressure from above. He's brought his own medical team and legal representatives. And how is Emiline responding to his presence? Dr. Winters asked, though the answer was obvious to anyone who looked at the child. She had positioned herself behind the couch, using the furniture as a barrier while her eyes remained fixed on the window where her father's vehicles waited. Dr. Hartwell approached Emiline with the careful movements of someone accustomed to working with severely traumatized children. She carried a small medical bag, but kept it closed and non-threatening as she settled onto the floor several feet away from where Emiline crouched. "Hello, Emiline," Dr. Hartwell said softly. "I'm a doctor who helps children who've been scared or hurt. I'd like to make sure you're healthy and safe. Would that be okay?" Emiline's response was to look at Wes and Bee, her eyes asking a question that transcended language barriers. When Wes nodded encouragingly and Bee moved closer to hold her hand, she slowly emerged from behind the couch. The medical examination that followed was conducted with extraordinary delicacy, but it still revealed troubling evidence of Emiline's ordeal. Malnutrition, signs of prolonged stress, and what appeared to be minor injuries consistent with rough handling or confinement. Most disturbing was what Dr. Hartwell found tucked into the waistband of Emiline's pants: a hospital identification bracelet that had been cut but not removed, its plastic surface bearing the logo of a medical facility none of the officials recognized. "St. Mary's Regional," Dr. Hartwell read aloud, examining the bracelet with professional interest. "But this isn't from any hospital in our database. The formatting is wrong, and the ID numbers don't match standard protocols." Agent Chen took possession of the bracelet with the careful handling reserved for potential evidence, but its implications were immediately troubling. If Emiline had been in medical care during her disappearance, why hadn't that facility reported her presence? And why would someone remove her from legitimate medical treatment only to abandon her in a small town park? "We need to speak with Mr. Vale about this," Chen said, though her tone suggested the conversation would be delicate. "He may have information about alternative medical facilities or treatments that weren't included in the initial missing person report." Bay, who had been quietly observing the adult conversations while maintaining protective proximity to Emiline, suddenly spoke up with the clarity that children often brought to complex situations. "Why don't you just ask Em what happened? She can tell you if you're patient with her signing." Dr. Winters exchanged glances with Dr. Hartwell, both women recognizing the wisdom in the 8-year-old's suggestion. Children's testimony required careful handling, especially in cases involving trauma, but Emiline's growing comfort with sign language might provide insights that formal interviews had failed to elicit. "Would you be willing to tell us about the hospital bracelet?" Dr. Winters asked Emiline, her hands moving in sign alongside her words. "You don't have to if you're not ready, but anything you can share might help us understand what happened to you." Emiline's response came in fragments, her limited signing vocabulary forcing her to find creative ways to express complex experiences. But gradually, a disturbing picture emerged. A medical facility that felt more like a prison, doctors who wouldn't look at her when she tried to sign, and the growing understanding that she was being kept there, not for treatment, but for some other purpose she couldn't fully articulate. "She keeps signing waiting," Bee translated, her young face troubled by the implications. "And people talking about money. She was in that place waiting for something, and adults were talking about money while she was there." The implications hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Dr. Hartwell's expression had shifted from professional concern to something darker, the recognition of patterns that suggested criminal rather than medical motivation for Emiline's confinement. Outside, Rowan Vale's patience was apparently wearing thin. Agent Chen's phone buzzed with increasing frequency, each call presumably escalating the pressure to produce results and reunification. But inside Wes's living room, a different drama was unfolding as Emiline continued to reveal fragments of her experience through the limited but growing vocabulary of her sign language. When the knock finally came at the front door, Emiline's reaction was immediate and visceral. She pressed herself against Wes's leg while her hands moved in desperate signs. "Don't let the loud man take me. Please don't let him yell." A plea that spoke volumes about her relationship with her biological father. B said gently, "Maybe he won't yell this time. Maybe he's learned how to be quieter." But when Agent Chen opened the door to admit Rowan Vale, it became immediately apparent that patience and quiet communication were not among the billionaire's current skill set. He entered the modest home with the commanding presence of someone accustomed to immediate deference, his voice carrying the authority of wealth and desperation as he scanned the room for his daughter. "Emiline," he said, his tone a mixture of relief and command that made the child shrink further against Wes's protective presence. "Thank God you're safe. We're going home now. I have doctors waiting, the best child psychologists in the country. Everything's going to be fine." Emiline's response was to bury her face against Wes's jacket, while her small hands moved in signs that needed no translation, pure terror and rejection of everything her father represented in that moment. The contrast between his expectations of joyful reunion and her reality of continued trauma couldn't have been more stark. "Mr. Vale," Dr. Winters interjected gently, "Emiline has been through significant trauma. Immediate transitions can be extremely damaging to her recovery process. Perhaps we could start with smaller steps, allowing her to adjust gradually to your presence." Rowan Vale's frustration was palpable, the kind of barely contained emotion that came from weeks of helplessness, followed by the expectation that money and authority could solve everything immediately. "She's my daughter," he said, his voice rising slightly despite obvious efforts at control. "I've been searching for her for 3 weeks. I have resources, proper facilities, everything she needs for recovery." "What she needs," Wes said quietly, his protective instincts overriding any deference to wealth or authority, "is to feel safe. And right now, you're scaring her." The words hung in the air like a challenge, creating a tension that everyone in the room could feel. Here was a small-town mechanic telling one of the state's wealthiest men that his presence was harmful to his own child, a confrontation that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. But these weren't normal circumstances, and Emiline's continued distress made the truth undeniable. She remained pressed against Wes, her small body trembling while her eyes stayed fixed on her father with the wariness of prey watching a predator. "Perhaps," Dr. Hartwell suggested diplomatically, "we could arrange a gradual reintroduction process. Supervised visits in a neutral setting, with Emiline maintaining access to the support system she's begun to trust." Rowan Vale's expression shifted through several emotions: frustration, recognition, and something that might have been the first glimpse of genuine understanding about his daughter's psychological state. For the first time since entering the room, he lowered his voice and attempted to address Emiline directly. "I'm sorry I scared you," he said, though his tone still carried more authority than comfort. "I was just so worried about you. I thought something terrible had happened." Emiline peeked out from behind Wes's jacket, her eyes assessing her father's words and demeanor with the hypervigilance of someone who'd learned to read threats in adult behavior. After a long moment, she signed something that made B's eyes widen with surprise. "She says something terrible did happen," B translated, her young voice carrying the weight of adult revelation. "And she says the scary doctors knew my name." The implications of that statement rippled through the room like shockwaves. If the medical facility where Emiline had been held knew her identity, then her disappearance hadn't been random kidnapping. It had been targeted, planned, and executed by people with specific knowledge of who she was and where she could be found. Dr. Hartwell leaned forward slightly, her professional instincts recognizing the significance of Emiline's revelation. "Can you tell us more about the scary doctors? Did they say why they knew your name?" Emiline's response came in halting signs. her limited vocabulary forcing her to repeat and rephrase as she struggled to convey complex memories. But gradually, another piece of the puzzle emerged. The doctors hadn't just known her name, they'd been expecting her, had prepared a room specifically for her arrival, and had discussed her case with people who weren't medical professionals. "She keeps signing waiting for Daddy to pay," Bea translated, her voice growing smaller as she began to understand the implications. Were they keeping you until your daddy gave them money?" Emiline nodded, then added signs that chilled everyone in the room. "But Daddy never came." Rowan Vale's face had gone pale, the composed authority of wealth replaced by something more human and more broken. "I never received any ransom demands," he said quietly. "No one ever contacted me about payment or exchange. The FBI investigation focused on random kidnapping, possibly trafficking. If someone was waiting for payment, then the people who took her weren't the same people who were holding her," Agent Chen concluded grimly. "And the real kidnappers never made contact because something went wrong with their plan." The realization settled over the room like a dark cloud. Emiline hadn't been rescued from her kidnappers. She'd been abandoned by them, left in the care of people who'd eventually grown tired of waiting for payment that never came. Her escape hadn't been heroic or planned. It had been the result of criminal negligence and failed coordination among people who'd viewed a 7-year-old child as nothing more than a commodity. "The hospital bracelet," Dr. Hartwell said suddenly, the pieces clicking together in her mind. If they were holding her in a facility that appeared medical but wasn't properly licensed, they could have kept her indefinitely without triggering official missing person protocols. Medical privacy laws would have prevented routine identification checks. As the adults grappled with the criminal implications of Emiline's ordeal, the child herself made a decision that surprised everyone. She slowly detached herself from Wes's protective presence and walked toward her father, stopping just out of arm's reach. Her hands moved in careful signs that brought tears to Rowan Vale's eyes. "What is she saying?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion he could no longer contain. Bea translated with the gravity of someone far older than her 8 years. "She says, I missed you, but you got too loud when you were scared. Can you try to be quieter like Wes?" For the first time since entering the room, Rowan Vale's composure completely cracked. He knelt down to Emiline's level, his hands shaking as he attempted to control both his voice and his emotions. "I can try to be quieter," he said, his words barely above a whisper. "I was so scared I'd lost you forever. Can you forgive me for being loud?" Emiline considered this for a long moment, then reached out to touch her father's hand briefly before returning to Wes's side. It wasn't reconciliation, but it was the beginning of possibility, the first crack in the wall of fear that had separated them. "We have a long road ahead," Dr. Winters observed quietly, watching the tentative interaction between father and daughter. "But this is the first real progress toward healing that I've seen since Emiline was found." Outside, the media circus was growing larger and more intrusive, but inside Wes's modest home, something fragile but precious was beginning to take shape. The possibility that a traumatized child might learn to trust again, that a desperate father might learn to listen, and that healing could emerge from the most unlikely combinations of circumstance and compassion. 3 days into what was supposed to be a temporary arrangement, Wes's house had transformed into an unlikely command center for one of the most complex missing child investigations in state history. FBI technicians had set up equipment in his garage, county social workers rotated through 8-hour shifts in his living room, and Dr. Winters had essentially taken up residence in the spare bedroom to monitor Emiline's psychological recovery around the clock. The breakthrough came when Agent Chen's digital forensics team finally managed to extract usable data from the corrupted security footage that Vale Industries had provided from the night of Emiline's disappearance. What they found challenged everything the investigation had assumed about the case. "The timestamps don't match," Agent Rodriguez announced, spreading printed screenshots across Wes's kitchen table while Emiline and Bee worked on puzzles in the adjacent living room. The estate's security system shows a gap of 47 minutes during the alleged kidnapping window, but the backup generator logs indicate continuous power supply throughout that period. Wes looked up from where he'd been preparing lunch, his mechanical mind immediately recognizing the significance of the discrepancy. If the backup power was running continuously, the security system shouldn't have any gaps at all. Someone would have had to manually disable the recording function. Exactly, Chen said grimly, which means this wasn't a random break-in or opportunistic kidnapping. Someone with intimate knowledge of the estate's security systems orchestrated this disappearance from the inside. Rowan Vale, who had spent the morning sitting quietly in Wes's living room, attempting to earn his daughter's tolerance through patience rather than authority, looked up with an expression that mixed betrayal with growing rage. "You're saying someone on my staff was involved in my daughter's kidnapping?" "We're saying the evidence points to an inside job," Rodriguez replied carefully. "Someone who knew the security protocols, had access to the system controls, and understood your daughter's routines well enough to plan her removal without triggering immediate alarm." The implications settled over the room like a toxic cloud. Emiline's disappearance hadn't been the work of strangers. It had been betrayal by people she'd trusted, violation of the very security that was supposed to protect her. Wes felt his protective instincts flare as he watched the small girl who'd found safety in his home, imagining the terror she must have felt when familiar faces turned threatening. Dr. Winters emerged from her temporary office, formerly Wes's study, carrying a folder thick with psychological assessment notes and interview transcripts. Her expression carried the weight of professional concern mixed with personal anger at what her evaluation had revealed. "Emiline's been making significant progress in art therapy," she announced, settling at the kitchen table where the adults had gathered. "But her drawings are telling us things that formal interviews haven't captured. She's been depicting scenes from before her disappearance that suggest she was already feeling unsafe in her own home." She spread several of Emiline's recent drawings across the table, each one executed with the crude precision of childhood, but containing details that made the adults lean forward with growing alarm. Stick figures with angry scribbles around their heads appeared repeatedly, always positioned near smaller figures that cowered or hid. Most disturbing were the drawings that showed the small figure watching from hiding places while the angry figures talked to other adults. "She was eavesdropping," Bee observed, having approached the table with the quiet curiosity that characterized her personality. "Em does that here too, but it's different. She listens to make sure everyone's being nice, not because she's scared of what they might say." The 8-year-old's insight cut straight to the heart of Emiline's psychological state. She'd learned to monitor adult conversations as a survival mechanism, gathering intelligence about threats and safety with the hyper-vigilance of someone who'd experienced betrayal by trusted caregivers. "There's something else," Dr. Winters continued, pulling out a drawing that made everyone at the table go silent. This one showed the small figure, clearly meant to represent Emiline, hiding behind furniture while watching stick figures exchange what appeared to be rectangular objects. Money, or documents, or something valuable enough to warrant secretive adult conversations. She witnessed planning sessions, Chen realized, her investigative instincts immediately recognizing the implications. Before her disappearance, Emiline saw the people who were plotting against her family. Rowan Vale's face had gone ashen as he studied his daughter's artwork. "My God," he whispered. She was living in terror for weeks, maybe months, watching people she trusted plan to hurt her, and I never noticed. I was so focused on business, on maintaining the Foundation's operations after Helena's death, that I completely missed my own. A daughter's fear. The mention of Helena, Emiline's mother, brought another dimension to the case that the investigation had largely overlooked. Wes found himself wondering about the timing of events, the connections between the mother's death and the daughter's subsequent trauma that had made her vulnerable to manipulation and betrayal. "Mr. Vale," Wes said carefully, recognizing that he was treading into sensitive territory, but driven by protective concern for Emiline. "How did your wife die?" Emiline's drawings suggest she was present for traumatic events before her kidnapping. Could there be a connection? The question hung in the air like a challenge, touching on grief that Rowan had clearly not fully processed, while simultaneously raising investigative possibilities that the official inquiry had apparently overlooked. Agent Chen's expression suggested this was territory they'd explored, but hadn't fully investigated. "Helena died in a car accident," Rowan said slowly, his voice carrying the careful control of someone revisiting painful memories. "Single vehicle. Collision on a mountain road near our estate. Weather was clear, road conditions were good. The investigation concluded that she'd fallen asleep at the wheel." "But Emiline was with her," Dr. Winters said, consulting her notes. "According to your original missing person report, your daughter was present during the accident, but survived with minimal physical injuries." "Minimal physical injuries," Wes repeated, his mechanical mind catching the significant qualifier. "But what about psychological trauma? A 7-year-old watching her mother die in a car crash would be devastating under any circumstances." Emiline, who had been coloring quietly in the living room, suddenly appeared at the kitchen doorway. Her arrival was silent, as always, but her presence shifted the energy in the room immediately. She'd learned to recognize when adults were discussing serious topics, and her expression carried the wariness of someone who'd learned that adult conversations often preceded dangerous changes. Bea noticed her friend's tension and moved to stand beside her, offering the kind of wordless support that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. "They're talking about your mom," she said gently, her hands moving in sign alongside her words. "It's okay to be sad about that." Emiline's response surprised everyone. Instead of the withdrawal or distress they'd come to expect when trauma was discussed, she walked directly to the table and pointed at one of her drawings, the one showing stick figures exchanging rectangular objects. Her hands moved in rapid signs that required Bea's translation to make sense to the adults. "She says the angry people were talking about her mom," Bea translated, her young voice carrying the weight of revelation. "She says they were happy when her mom got hurt, and they talked about taking care of the little problem after the big problem was solved." The implications crashed over the room like a physical force. Helena Vale's death hadn't been an accident. It had been murder, witnessed by a child who'd then been marked as a threat that needed to be eliminated. Emiline's kidnapping hadn't been about ransom or random crime. It had been about silencing the only witness to her mother's assassination. Agent Chen was already reaching for her phone, presumably to contact the team investigating Helena Vale's death and request immediate reopening of that case. But Rodriguez was studying Emiline's drawings with the intensity of someone recognizing patterns that had been missed in the initial investigation. If she witnessed her mother's murder and then overheard the conspirators planning her own removal, Rodriguez said slowly, she's been living with the knowledge that people she trusted killed her mother and were planning to kill her too. The trauma response we've been treating as kidnapping aftermath is actually months of anticipatory terror. Dr. Winters looked stricken as the full scope of Emiline's psychological burden became clear. "She's been carrying this alone for months," she said. "A 7-year-old child, watching the people responsible for her mother's death plan her own elimination, with no way to communicate her fears to the adults who were supposed to protect her." Wes felt a rage building in his chest that was unlike anything he'd experienced since Sarah's death. This child, this brave, resilient little girl who'd found the courage to trust again despite everything she'd endured, had been failed by every adult system that was supposed to keep her safe. Her own family's wealth and status had made her a target, and the very people employed to protect her had been the instruments of her trauma. He said gently, crouching down to her level while keeping his voice calm despite the fury he felt. "You're safe now. The people who hurt your mom can't hurt you anymore. Do you understand that?" Emiline studied his face with the intensity of someone who'd learned to read adult emotions for signs of threat or safety. After a long moment, she nodded slowly, then signed something that made Bee's eyes fill with tears. "She says she knows. She's safe with us," Bee translated. "But she's worried about what happens when she has to leave. She says the bad people have long arms and they know how to wait." The phrase "long arms" carried implications that chilled everyone at the table. Emiline had learned through devastating experience that wealth and power could reach across any distance to eliminate threats. Her fear wasn't irrational childhood anxiety. It was informed assessment of danger based on witnessing exactly what these people were capable of achieving. Rowan Vale stood abruptly, his composure finally cracking under the weight of revelation and guilt. "This is my fault," he said, his voice thick with self-recrimination. "I trusted the wrong people. I was so devastated by Helena's death that I delegated too much authority, relied too heavily on staff members whose loyalty I never properly verified. My daughter paid the price for my negligence. Self-blame isn't productive right now," Dr. Winters said firmly. "What's productive is ensuring Emiline's continued safety while we identify and neutralize the actual threats." Agent Chen finished her phone call and rejoined the group with an expression that mixed professional determination with personal anger. "I've requested immediate federal protection for Emiline and the Calder family," she announced, "and we're reopening the Helena Vale investigation with full forensic review. If this is a conspiracy involving estate staff, we need to identify every participant before they realize how much Emiline remembers." "What about the medical facility where she was held?" Wes asked. "If they were keeping her in some kind of fake hospital, there have to be records, financial transactions, personnel files." "Already working on it," Rodriguez replied. "But these people have had months to cover their tracks. We're essentially starting over with an investigation that should have begun the day Helena Vale died." Emiline had been listening to this conversation with the focused attention of someone whose survival depended on understanding adult plans and motivations. Now she tugged on Bee's sleeve and signed something that made her young translator's eyes widen with concern. "She wants to know if the bad people know where she is now," Bee said. "She's worried that being on TV and in the newspapers told them where to find her." The question hung in the air like a sword, highlighting a security concern that the investigation had perhaps not adequately addressed. Emiline's rescue had been covered extensively by local and national media. If members of the conspiracy were still at large and monitoring news coverage, they would know exactly where to find the witness who could destroy their carefully constructed cover story. "We need to move her," Chen said immediately, recognizing the security implications. "Federal safe house, complete isolation, until we can identify and arrest the remaining conspirators." "No," Wes said firmly, surprising himself with the vehemence of his response. "She's just started to feel safe here. Moving her to another unfamiliar environment will undo weeks of psychological progress." "Mr. Calder," Rodriguez said carefully, "we understand your protective feelings, but this child is a material witness in a murder case involving people with significant resources and demonstrated willingness to eliminate threats. Her safety has to take priority over her comfort." Emiline, who had been following this exchange with growing distress, suddenly walked over to Wes and wrapped her small arms around his waist. Her message was clear without any need for translation. She'd found safety with the Calder family, and the prospect of being separated from them felt like another form of abandonment. "What if we brought the protection here?" Dr. Winters suggested. "Secure the house, establish perimeter security, but allow Emiline to remain in the environment where she's made psychological progress." It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but addressed everyone's primary concerns. Within hours, Wes's modest home had been transformed into a fortress, surrounded by federal agents and equipped with security systems that made Rowan Vale's estate look vulnerable by comparison. But even as the adults worked to ensure physical safety, Emiline continued to create drawings that revealed new pieces of the conspiracy. Late that evening, she presented Wes with a picture that made his blood run cold. Stick figures that appeared to show someone tampering with a car, while a small figure watched from a hiding place nearby. She saw them sabotage her mother's car. Wes realized, his voice barely above a whisper. She witnessed the murder being set up, and she's been carrying that knowledge for months. The weight of that revelation settled over the house like a shroud. Emiline hadn't just lost her mother in a tragic accident. She'd watched trusted adults orchestrate that loss, then listened to them plan her own elimination as the loose end that needed to be tied up. That she'd survived, escaped, and found the courage to begin trusting again spoke to a resilience that humbled every adult who'd failed to protect her. As night fell over Cedar Falls, the media circus that had gathered around the story began to disperse, but inside the heavily guarded house, a small girl continued to draw pictures that would ultimately bring justice for her mother and safety for herself. The conspiracy that had destroyed her family was about to discover that 7-year-old witnesses, when given the right support and protection, could be more dangerous to criminal enterprises than any adult investigator. The discovery came at 3 in the morning, when Wes couldn't sleep and decided to sort through Sarah's remaining possessions in the basement storage room. He'd been avoiding this task for months, but the presence of federal agents throughout his house had given him a restless energy that needed direction. Among the carefully labeled boxes containing her teaching materials and sign language resources, he found something that shouldn't have existed. A manila envelope bearing the letterhead of Vale Industries, dated just 2 weeks before Sarah's death. His hands trembled as he opened the envelope and found a series of financial documents that made no immediate sense. Bank routing numbers, offshore account information, and what appeared to be payment. Schedules for services rendered. But it was the handwritten note in Sarah's careful script that made his world tilt on its axis. Evidence of HV murder plot. Insurance policy if anything happens to me. Trust Wes with ease safety. The basement suddenly felt airless as the implications crashed over him like a physical weight. Sarah had known about Helena Vale's planned assassination. She'd been investigating the conspiracy, gathering evidence, and preparing for the possibility that her knowledge would make her a target. The brain tumor that had killed her hadn't been a tragic coincidence. It had been induced murder, designed to eliminate a witness who'd gotten too close to the truth. Wes's grief transformed into fury as he realized that his wife's death had been orchestrated by the same people who'd later targeted Emiline. Sarah's work as a sign language interpreter had somehow connected her to the Vale family conspiracy, and her investigation had signed her death warrant. The insurance policy she'd mentioned meant she'd expected to be eliminated, and she'd hidden evidence that could destroy her killers. But the most staggering revelation was the final line of her note: trust Wes with ease safety. Sarah had known that Emiline would eventually need protection, and she'd specifically identified her husband as the person who could provide it. Emiline's appearance in Cedar Falls hadn't been coincidence. It had been the fulfillment of a plan that Sarah had set in motion before her own murder. Agent Chen found him sitting on the basement floor at dawn, surrounded by the scattered documents and staring at his wife's handwriting with an expression that mixed devastation with resolve. "Mr. Calder, we heard noise downstairs and wanted to check." She stopped mid-sentence as she saw the papers spread around him. "My wife was murdered," Wes said quietly, his voice carrying the flat certainty of someone whose worldview had been fundamentally altered. She was investigating Helena Vale's planned assassination, and they killed her to keep her quiet. Brain tumors can be induced with the right toxins, the right radiation exposure. Sarah knew too much, so they eliminated her. Chen knelt beside him, her trained eyes scanning the financial documents and recognizing their significance immediately. "These are payment records for contract killers," she said grimly. "Offshore accounts, coded service descriptions, assassination fees disguised as consulting payments. Your wife uncovered a murder-for-hire operation that was targeting the Vale, her family." "She knew Emiline would need protection," Wes continued, holding up Sarah's note with hands that shook with suppressed rage. "She specifically named me as someone who could keep her safe. Em's escape, her arrival in Cedar Falls, her appearance at our park, none of it was random. Sarah set it up before they killed her." The investigation that followed moved with the precision of federal law enforcement focused on a specific target. Within hours, forensic accountants were tracing the offshore accounts that Sarah had documented, while toxicology experts began reviewing her medical records for signs of induced illness. The web of conspiracy that emerged was more extensive and more chilling than anyone had initially imagined. Dr. Marcus Webb, the oncologist who treated Sarah's brain tumor, arrived at the house by noon with medical records and an expression that suggested professional devastation. "I've been reviewing Mrs. Calder's case files in light of the new evidence," he announced to the assembled investigators. "The tumor's location and aggressive growth pattern are consistent with radiation-induced malignancy. If someone had access to her workplace, her car, even her home, they could have exposed her to targeted radiation over several weeks." Emiline, who had been working on puzzles with B in the living room, looked up at the mention of illness and death. Her young face showed the hyper-alert expression that had become familiar when adults discussed topics that might affect her. Safety. But instead of withdrawing, she approached the kitchen table where the adults were gathered and placed a new drawing among the scattered documents. This drawing was different from her previous artwork, more detailed, more specific, showing stick figures in what appeared to be a medical setting. One figure lay on a table, while others stood around with rectangular objects that might have been medical equipment. In the corner, a small figure watched from behind a doorway. She witnessed Sarah's treatment, Dr. Winters realized, studying the drawing with professional recognition. "Emiline, were you at the hospital when Mrs. Calder was getting her cancer treatment?" Emiline nodded, then began signing rapidly, while B translated with growing excitement. "She says she was there lots of times because they brought her to a visit when her mom was getting her own treatments. She says the doctors were the same ones who later took her to the scary place." The revelation hit the room like an explosion. The medical facility where Emiline had been held wasn't separate from Sarah's treatment. It was the same operation, the same conspirators who'd induced Sarah's cancer and then used their medical cover to imprison her daughter. Dr. Webb's involvement wasn't coincidental. He was part of the murder conspiracy. "Dr. Webb," Agent Chen said carefully, her hand moving toward her weapon while maintaining professional calm. "I think we need to have a more detailed conversation about your treatment protocols and facility security." Webb's reaction confirmed every suspicion. Instead of professional cooperation, he bolted toward the back door, only to be intercepted by federal agents who'd been positioned throughout the house. His arrest was swift and efficient, but his attempt to flee had revealed the scope of medical corruption that had enabled both murders. The whole cancer treatment center was a front, Rodriguez realized as they processed Webb's confession over the following hours. Legitimate patients received real treatment, but the facility was also used for contract elimination services disguised as medical care. They could induce illness, provide false documentation, even dispose of bodies through cremation services. Rowan Vale, who had been quietly observing his daughter's continued revelations, looked stricken as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. Helena was receiving treatment there for depression after Emiline's communication difficulties began, he said slowly. She'd been seeing Dr. Webb for months before her death. They used her legitimate medical appointments to plan her assassination, and they kept Emiline there after her kidnapping because it was a facility they controlled completely, Chen added. Medical privacy laws prevented outside oversight, and they could maintain the fiction that she was receiving treatment for trauma while they decided how to eliminate her permanently. Emiline, who had been following this conversation with the focused attention of someone whose survival depended on understanding adult plans, suddenly walked over to Rowan and signed something that made Bee gasp with surprise. She says she's sorry she couldn't save her mom, Bee translated, tears streaming down her face. She says she tried to warn the adults, but nobody understood her signs about the bad doctors. The room went silent as everyone processed the implications of a 7-year-old child apologizing for failing to prevent her mother's murder. Emiline had been trying to communicate the danger she'd witnessed, but her limited signing vocabulary and the adult's failure to listen carefully had prevented her warnings from being understood. Rowan knelt down to his daughter's level, his own eyes wet with tears he could no longer contain. "Emiline," he said softly, his voice carrying none of the authority or impatience that had characterized his earlier interactions. "You have nothing to apologize for. The adults failed you, not the other way around. You were brave and smart, and you survived when terrible people tried to hurt our family." For the first time since her rescue, Emiline moved willingly toward her biological father, not into his arms, but close enough to touch his hand briefly, a gesture of tentative forgiveness and the beginning of rebuilding trust that had been shattered by months of terror and betrayal. The legal proceedings that followed moved with unprecedented speed, driven by the overwhelming evidence that Sarah and Emiline had provided through their different but complementary forms of documentation. Dr. Webb's medical records revealed a pattern of suspicious patient deaths that extended back years, while the financial documents led to arrests of estate staff members who'd been receiving payment for inside information and security system access. But the most significant breakthrough came when federal forensic experts found Sarah's hidden audio recordings preserved on a small digital device that she'd concealed in her teaching materials. Her voice, captured in secret conversations with Dr. Webb and his associates, provided irrefutable proof of the murder conspiracy and the planned elimination of witnesses. "Sarah knew she was dying," Dr. Winters observed as they listened to the recordings, "but she used her final weeks to gather evidence that would eventually save Emiline and bring justice for Helena. She turned her own murder into a trap for the people who killed her." Emiline's reaction to hearing Sarah's voice was immediate and profound. She ran to the audio equipment and placed her small hands on the speakers, signing frantically while tears streamed down her face. Bee translated through her own sobs. She says Mrs. Sarah was her secret friend who taught her special signs when the doctors weren't watching. She says Mrs. Sarah promised someone would come to help her, and that, someone was you, Dad. Wes felt his knees buckle as the full scope of Sarah's sacrifice became clear. His wife hadn't just been investigating a murder conspiracy, she'd been orchestrating Emiline's rescue, using her final months to create a network of protection that would activate after her death. Her insistence on teaching Wes and Bee advanced. Sign language, her work with the county school system, even her choice of doctors and medical facilities. All of it had been preparation for the day when a traumatized child would need their help. "She planned everything," he whispered, staring at the audio equipment that contained his wife's voice. "Sarah knew exactly what would happen, and she spent her last months making sure Em would find her way to safety." The investigation's conclusion brought justice, but not closure. The conspiracy had been extensive, involving medical professionals, estate security personnel, and offshore financial networks that had operated for years. But the price of that justice had been paid by two women who'd sacrificed everything to protect a child who couldn't protect herself. As the federal agents began dismantling their command center and preparing to return Emiline to some version of normal life, the question of her future remained unresolved. Rowan Vale had legal custody, unlimited resources, and a genuine desire to rebuild his relationship with his daughter. But Emiline had found safety and healing with the Calder family, and the prospect of separation threatened to undo all the psychological progress she'd made. "She needs both families," Dr. Winters observed during a final consultation meeting. "Legal guardianship with her father, but continued access to the support system that helped her heal. This isn't a custody case, it's a child welfare situation that requires creative solutions." The solution they developed was unprecedented but practical. Shared custody that allowed Emiline to maintain her school enrollment in Cedar Falls while spending weekends and holidays with her father at a new, secure residence he'd established in the area. Wes would continue as her primary caregiver during the week, while Rowan gradually rebuilt their relationship through patient, consistent presence rather than authoritative demands. Most importantly, Emiline would have the final say in any changes to these arrangements. Her voice, expressed through sign language and translated by B when necessary, would be the determining factor in decisions about her care and custody. The adults who'd failed to listen to her warnings would not make that mistake again. As the last of the federal equipment was removed from his house, Wes stood in his living room holding one of Emiline's recent drawings, this one showing two families connected by bridges made of hands, with a small figure moving freely between them. Sarah's presence seemed to fill the room, her love and sacrifice having created exactly the outcome she'd planned: a child saved, a conspiracy destroyed, and a new family structure built on understanding rather than ownership. The memory garden they would plant that spring would honor Sarah's sacrifice while celebrating Emiline's survival. But the real memorial to Sarah's love was already growing in the relationships she'd helped create between people who'd learned to communicate across any barrier when the motivation was protecting someone they loved. The audio recording device was smaller than a hearing aid battery, hidden inside the spine of Sarah's well-worn ASL dictionary with the precision of someone who'd known her time was running out. Agent Chen discovered it during the final forensic sweep of Sarah's materials, triggered by an inconsistency in the book's weight that her trained fingers had detected while cataloging evidence. When they played the first recording, Sarah's voice filled Wes's living room with the clarity of someone speaking directly from beyond the grave. But her words carried revelations that shattered every assumption the investigation had built about the conspiracy's scope and motivation. Recording number 12, October 15th, 3 days before my final treatment, Sarah's voice said with the measured calm of someone documenting evidence for posterity. Dr. Webb has confirmed that the radiation exposure was deliberately calculated to ensure rapid tumor growth while maintaining plausible medical deniability. But he's also revealed something that changes everything about why Helena and Emiline were targeted. The assembled listeners, Wes, B, Emiline, Rowan, and the federal agents, leaned forward as Sarah's investigation unfolded through her own words. But nothing could have prepared them for what came next. Helena Vale wasn't killed because she discovered financial irregularities or threatened to expose estate corruption, Sarah continued, her voice carrying the weight of devastating discovery. She was eliminated because she'd learned that Emiline isn't Rowan's biological daughter. Helena had commissioned DNA testing after noticing inconsistencies in Emiline's medical records, and the results proved that Rowan Vale has been unknowingly raising another man's child. The silence that followed was profound and terrible. Rowan's face had gone ashen, while Emiline looked between the adults with the heightened alertness of someone who'd learned to recognize when family structures were about to shift in dangerous ways. The conspiracy wasn't about money or estate control, Sarah's voice continued relentlessly. It was about protecting a decades-long deception that involved artificial insemination fraud, falsified medical records, and systematic manipulation of one of the state's wealthiest families. Helena discovered that the fertility clinic where she'd received treatment had substituted donor sperm without consent, and that Emiline's biological father was someone with significant criminal connections. Bay's hands moved instinctively to translate Sarah's words into sign language for Emiline, but she stopped herself as she realized the implications of what they were hearing. This wasn't just investigation evidence, it was information that could destroy the fragile family bonds that had been slowly rebuilding over the past weeks. Agent Chen paused the recording, recognizing that the revelations required immediate processing before they continued. "Mr. Vale," she said carefully, "did you have any knowledge of irregularities in your wife's fertility treatments?" Rowan's response came in fragments, his voice hollow with shock and disbelief. Helena struggled. "With fertility for years before Emiline was conceived. We used the most respected clinic in the state, doctors with impeccable reputations. The pregnancy was difficult, but Emiline's birth felt like a miracle after so many failed attempts. A miracle orchestrated by people who substituted anonymous donor material with sperm from someone whose identity they needed to conceal," Agent Rodriguez concluded grimly. "Someone whose connection to your family would have been catastrophic if discovered." Dr. Winters, who had been observing Emiline's reactions throughout this revelation, intervened with professional concern. "This child has endured enough trauma without having her fundamental identity questioned. Whatever the biological facts might be, Rowan Vale is the only father she's ever known." But Emiline surprised everyone by approaching the audio equipment and pointing at it with determination. Her hands moved in rapid signs that Bee translated reluctantly. "She wants to hear the rest. She says she needs to know the truth about who hurt her family." The second recording revealed the scope of the deception with clinical precision. Sarah had traced the artificial insemination fraud to a network that extended through multiple fertility clinics, involving systematic substitution of donor genetic material and falsification of medical records. Wealthy families who'd struggled with fertility had been unknowingly raising children whose biological fathers were career criminals, foreign agents, or others whose genetics were being preserved through deceptive means. "Emiline's biological father is Marcus Volkov," Sarah's voice announced with devastating clarity, "a Russian arms dealer who's been laundering money through American fertility clinics for over a decade. The clinic was paid to ensure his genetic material was used in procedures involving wealthy American families, creating children who could eventually provide cover for international criminal operations." The implications cascaded through the room like dominoes falling in sequence. Emiline wasn't just an innocent victim of family conspiracy, she was the unknowing product of international criminal enterprise, her very existence designed to create future leverage against one of America's wealthiest philanthropic families. Helena discovered this when she requested Emiline's complete medical records for a routine school physical. Sarah continued. "The genetic markers didn't match what she expected, so she commissioned independent DNA testing. When the results confirmed that Rowan wasn't Emiline's biological father, she began investigating how such a substitution could have occurred." Rowan Vale stood abruptly, his composure finally shattered by revelations that attacked not just his understanding of recent events, but his fundamental beliefs about his family structure. "You're telling me that the daughter I've loved and raised for 7 years isn't biologically mine, and that her real father is an international criminal who orchestrated her conception as some kind of long-term infiltration plan. We're telling you that biology doesn't determine love, and that criminal manipulation doesn't negate the genuine family bonds you've created." Dr. Winters said firmly. But yes, the evidence suggests that Emiline's conception was part of a larger criminal conspiracy. Emiline, who had been following this conversation with the focused attention of someone whose survival had always depended on understanding adult motivations, suddenly walked over to Rowan and signed something that made everyone in the room stop breathing. She says it doesn't matter who her first daddy was. B translated through tears. She says her real daddy is the one who loves her and keeps her safe, and that's Mr. Rowan and Mr. Wes, both. The simple wisdom of a 7-year-old cut through the complexity of genetics and criminal conspiracy with devastating clarity. Whatever the circumstances of her conception, Emiline had found love and safety with people who'd chosen to protect her regardless of biological connection. But Sarah's recordings weren't finished revealing their secrets. The third and final audio file contained information that transformed the entire investigation from a family tragedy into a matter of national security. Marcus Volkov isn't just laundering money through fertility fraud, Sarah's voice announced, with the calm of someone documenting evidence for prosecutors she'd never lived to see. He's creating sleeper agents. Children with American citizenship, raised in wealthy families, educated in elite institutions, and eventually contacted by handlers who reveal their true parentage and activate them for intelligence operations. Agent Chen was already reaching for her secure phone, recognizing that this investigation had just escalated beyond local law enforcement capabilities. "How many children?" she asked the recording device. Though Sarah's dead voice couldn't respond to questions, the answer came in Sarah's methodical documentation. At least 47 confirmed cases across 12 states, possibly more that I haven't identified. The fertility clinic network has been operating for 15 years, targeting families with political connections, financial influence, or strategic business interests. Emiline was intended to be activated when she reached adolescence, using her father's philanthropic connections to provide cover for intelligence-gathering operations. They were building an army, Rodriguez realized with growing horror. 47 American citizens with impeccable family credentials, all unknowingly connected to Russian intelligence operations through their biological father. Dr. Winters looked stricken as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. Helena Vale discovered this plot, and they killed her to prevent exposure. But they kept Emiline alive because she was still valuable, either as a future asset or as leverage against her adoptive father. "And Sarah died because she was helping Helena document the evidence," Wes said quietly, his voice thick with grief and rage. "My wife was murdered for trying to protect children from being turned into weapons." The investigation that followed moved with the urgency of national security protocol. Federal agencies coordinated to identify and contact the other 46. Families whose children had been conceived through the fraudulent fertility network. Some parents chose to maintain silence and secrecy. Others demanded immediate investigation and prosecution. But throughout the bureaucratic chaos that engulfed their lives, Emiline remained focused on simpler truths. She continued creating drawings that showed her chosen family, Wes, B, and gradually Rowan, connected by bonds of choice rather than genetics. Her art therapy sessions revealed not confusion about identity, but clarity about what constituted real family relationships. She understands that love is more important than blood, Dr. Winters observed during one of her final evaluation sessions. This child has experienced the worst that adults can inflict on children, but she's learned to recognize genuine care and protection when she finds it. The legal proceedings that resulted from Sarah's evidence were extensive and international in scope. Marcus Volkov was arrested in Switzerland and extradited to face charges in American courts. The fertility clinic network was dismantled, with dozens of medical professionals facing criminal prosecution for their roles in the conspiracy. But the most significant outcome was the quiet decision made by 47 American families to love their children regardless of genetic origin, and to protect them from the criminal enterprise that had orchestrated their conception. Biology had been weaponized against them, but love and choice proved stronger than genetic manipulation. For Emiline, the revelation of her biological parentage ultimately changed nothing about her daily reality. She continued dividing her time between the Calder house during school weeks and her father's residence on weekends. Rowan had chosen to adopt her formally, making their legal relationship as strong as their emotional bond had become. Most importantly, she'd learned that families could be created through choice, commitment, and communication, lessons that Sarah had somehow anticipated and prepared for, even in her final weeks. The conspiracy had tried to turn genetics into weapons, but it had ultimately been defeated by people who chose love over biology, protection over profit, and truth over deception. As spring approached Cedar Falls, the investigation was concluding, but the healing was just beginning. Emiline's drawings had evolved from depicting trauma and fear to showing gardens and growth, bridges and connections. The criminal conspiracy that had destroyed her biological family had inadvertently led her to people who would love and protect her regardless of any genetic revelation. Sarah's final gift hadn't just been evidence that destroyed a criminal network. It had been the creation of a family structure strong enough to survive any revelation, built on understanding rather than assumption and sustained by communication that transcended the barriers between hearts that chose to connect across any distance. The emergency custody hearing was scheduled for Thursday morning, but by Wednesday evening it had become clear that powerful forces were working to prevent Emiline's story from reaching public attention. Judge Patricia Hammond, who was supposed to preside over the proceedings, received death threats that were serious enough to warrant federal protection. The courthouse had been subjected to a cyber attack that corrupted digital records, and 3 key witnesses had mysteriously become unavailable due to sudden family emergencies or unexpected health crises. Agent Chen paced Wes's living room with the frustrated energy of someone watching a carefully built case being systematically dismantled by adversaries with unlimited resources and no ethical constraints. They're trying to create enough chaos to force a closed hearing or an indefinite postponement, she said, her phone buzzing constantly with updates from federal coordinators. Volkov's people know that public exposure will destroy any remaining sleeper agent networks. Wes studied the legal documents spread across his kitchen table, their official language failing to capture the human stakes of the proceedings. These papers would determine whether Emiline remained in the stable, loving environment where she'd begun to heal, or was transferred to institutional care while bureaucratic machinery ground through months of processing and investigation. What if we make it impossible for them to suppress the story? B suggested, with the clarity that children often brought to adult problems. If everyone already knows what happened, they can't hide it anymore. Dr. Winters looked up from her psychological evaluation notes with professional interest. You're suggesting preemptive media exposure? That could be risky for Emiline's psychological recovery, but it might also ensure that the truth receives public attention regardless of what happens in court. Emiline, who had been working on a particularly detailed drawing at the coffee table, suddenly stood and walked over to the adults with the purposeful movement of someone who'd made an important decision. She placed her latest artwork on top of the legal documents, a picture that showed stick figures standing in front of what appeared to be a large crowd, with hands raised and mouths open as if speaking to an audience. She wants to tell her story publicly, B translated, her 8-year-old voice carrying the weight of adult understanding. She says if people know the truth, the bad people can't hurt other kids like they hurt her. The suggestion was breathtaking in its courage and terrifying in its implications. A 7-year-old child who'd been systematically traumatized by adults who were supposed to protect her, was volunteering to expose herself to public scrutiny in order to prevent other children from experiencing similar abuse. Rowan Vale, who had been quietly observing from the corner chair where he'd learned to position himself, close enough to participate but not so close as to intimidate his daughter, spoke with voice thick with paternal pride and terror. "Emiline, sweetheart, talking to reporters and cameras might be very scary. Are you sure you want to do that?" Emiline's response was to walk over to her father and sign something that made his eyes fill with tears. She then repeated the same signs to Wes, creating a bridge of communication that included both of the men who'd become her protectors. "She says she's not scared of cameras because cameras can't hurt her," B translated. "She says she's only scared of secrets because secrets are what let the bad people win." The wisdom of her perspective was undeniable, but the practical challenges were enormous. Media appearances by child witnesses required careful psychological preparation, legal authorization, and security measures that could protect Emiline from retaliation while ensuring her voice was heard accurately. "We'd need to control the narrative completely," Agent Chen said, her investigative mind recognizing the strategic possibilities. "Exclusive interview with a trusted journalist, recorded here in the house where she feels safe, with translation, support from Bear and psychological monitoring from Dr. Winters, and we'd need to coordinate the release with tomorrow's hearing," Rodriguez added. "Public pressure could prevent judicial manipulation, but timing would be critical to maximize impact while protecting Emiline's legal interests." Dr. Winters was already making notes about psychological preparation protocols. "She's demonstrated remarkable resilience, but media exposure could trigger trauma responses we haven't seen yet. We'd need safeguards, escape protocols, and immediate intervention capabilities." The planning that followed was intense and meticulous, driven by the recognition that they had one opportunity to get this right. A single misstep could traumatize Emiline further, while simultaneously destroying the legal case that had taken weeks to build. Janet Morrison, whose husband David had become the county's primary liaison for the case, arrived that evening with news that added urgency to their media strategy. "Judge Hammond has been removed from the case due to the security threats," she announced grimly. "Her replacement is Judge Marcus Thornfield, who has a history of ruling in favor of institutional placement over family-based care." The implication was clear. Tomorrow's hearing was likely to result in Emiline's removal from the Calder home and placement in state custody, while the legal complexities were resolved through bureaucratic channels that could take months or years to complete. Judge Thornfield also has financial connections to several medical facilities that have been linked to the fertility clinic network, Agent Chen added, with barely controlled anger. "He's exactly the kind of jurist that Volkov's people would want overseeing this case." Emiline, who had been listening to this conversation with the focused attention she brought to all adult discussions that might affect her safety, suddenly grabbed her notebook and began drawing with rapid, determined strokes. The image that emerged showed stick figures in what appeared to be a courtroom, with one small figure standing at a podium while larger figures listened from elevated positions. "She wants to talk to the judge herself," Bee realized, studying her friend's artwork. "She wants to tell him why she should stay with us." The idea was both inspiring and heartbreaking. A child who'd been failed by every adult authority system, volunteering to advocate for herself in the institutional setting that had consistently prioritized bureaucratic convenience over human welfare. Legally, children her age can provide input about custody preferences, David Morrison confirmed when he arrived for the evening planning session. But practically, judges often discount children's testimony as emotionally rather than rationally motivated. Then we make sure her emotional motivation is backed up by expert testimony and documented evidence, Dr. Winters said firmly. This child has demonstrated remarkable psychological progress in her current placement. Removing her would be professionally indefensible. The media interview was conducted at midnight, when the house was quiet and Emiline felt most secure. Rebecca Martinez, an investigative journalist whose work on child welfare had earned national recognition, arrived with a single camera operator and the kind of gentle professionalism that immediately put Emiline at ease. The interview itself was extraordinary, not because of dramatic revelations or emotional breakdowns, but because of the quiet dignity with which a 7-year-old child recounted experiences that would have shattered most adults. Emiline's limited but growing sign language vocabulary, translated by B with remarkable accuracy, told a story of systematic betrayal followed by healing through genuine love and protection. The people who hurt my mom and took me away thought I couldn't tell anyone what I saw because I don't talk with my voice, Emiline signed, her small hands moving with increasing confidence as the interview progressed. But Wes and B taught me that there are lots of ways to tell the truth if people are willing to listen. The most powerful moment came when Martinez asked about her future preferences. Emiline's response required no translation. She simply walked over to where Wes and B were sitting just off camera and took their hands, then gestured for Rowan to join them. The image of chosen family, built on understanding rather than genetics, spoke more eloquently than any legal argument could achieve. Some people think families have to be about the same blood, she signed with B translating, but I think families are about people who keep you safe and help you grow and love you even when you're scared. That's what these people do for me. The interview aired at 6 in the morning, strategically timed to reach maximum audience before the courthouse opened for business. By 8 o'clock, the story had gone viral across social media platforms, with the justice for Emiline trending nationally and thousands of messages supporting her right to remain with the family that had helped her heal. Judge Thornfield arrived at the courthouse to find it surrounded by protesters carrying signs demanding transparency and justice. Media vans filled the parking lot, while family advocacy groups had organized demonstrations supporting children's rights to have their voices heard in custody decisions. Inside the courthouse, the hearing had been transformed from a routine administrative proceeding into a public examination of institutional failure and family resilience. The emergency custody papers that would have quietly transferred Emiline to state care became impossible to sign under the weight of public scrutiny and media attention. Your Honor, the state's attorney began nervously, given the unusual circumstances and the level of public interest in this case, the state would like to request a continuance to review our custody recommendations. Judge Thornfield, who had clearly expected to handle this case with bureaucratic efficiency rather than public accountability, found himself presiding over a hearing that was being broadcast live and analyzed by child welfare experts across the country. Dr. Winters took the witness stand with professional authority and personal passion, presenting psychological evidence that made institutional placement seem not just unnecessary, but actively harmful to Emiline's continued recovery. This child has made remarkable progress in her current placement, she testified, with the kind of clinical certainty that brooked no argument. Removing her from the family structure where she's learned to trust and communicate would constitute a form of institutional abuse disguised as child protection. Agent Chen's testimony focused on security considerations, documenting the extensive measures that had been taken to ensure Emiline's physical safety while allowing her psychological healing to continue in a family environment. But the most compelling testimony came from Emiline herself. When Judge Thornfield asked if she understood the proceedings and had any preferences about her placement, she stood at the witness table and began signing with the clear determination of someone who'd found her voice and intended to use it. I know some adults think I should go live in a place with other kids who don't have families, B translated from the gallery, her 8-year-old voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom. "But I'm not a kid without a family. I have 2 dads and a sister who taught me that love is stronger than scary people." She paused in her signing to look directly at Judge Thornfield, then continued with the kind of clarity that transcended age and legal complexity. "The people who hurt my mum and tried to hurt me thought they could win because I couldn't tell anyone what I saw. But my family taught me that there are lots of ways to tell the truth when people are willing to listen. I want to stay with the people who listened to me when nobody else would." The courtroom remained silent as Emiline concluded her testimony, but the emotional weight of her words was palpable. Judge Thornfield, who had presumably entered the hearing with predetermined conclusions about institutional placement, found himself confronting the reality of a child who'd not only survived systematic trauma, but emerged with wisdom that challenged adult assumptions about family structure and child welfare. "Miss Vale," he said quietly, "do you understand that Mr. Calder and your biological father would continue to share custody arrangements if you remained in your current placement?" Emiline nodded, then signed something that made several people in the gallery wipe away tears. "She says she understands that families can be big enough to include everyone who loves you," B translated. "She says that's what her first mom taught her before the bad people hurt her. And that's what Mrs. Sarah taught her too, even though she never got to meet her." Judge Thornfield looked out at the packed courtroom, the media cameras, and the child who'd somehow managed to articulate a vision of family that was both simple and profound. His decision, when it came, was delivered with the kind of judicial authority that acknowledged both legal precedent and human wisdom. Emergency custody will remain with Mr. Calder, with shared parental rights continuing for Mr. Vale. This court finds that the current placement serves the child's best interests and that any disruption would be contrary to her demonstrated psychological progress. The cheering that erupted from the gallery was immediate and sustained, but Emiline's reaction was quieter and more profound. She simply walked over to where her chosen family was sitting and signed something that needed no translation. "Thank you for helping me tell the truth." Outside the courthouse, the media circus continued, but inside, a small group of people who'd learned to communicate across any barrier when the motivation was love and protection. The real victory was simpler. A child who'd been systematically failed by institutional systems had found her voice and used it to choose her own family structure. The conspiracy that had tried to turn genetics into weapons had been defeated not by superior resources or legal maneuvering, but by the simple power of a child who'd learned that truth, when supported by genuine love, could overcome any form of institutional failure or criminal manipulation. The live broadcast camera had been Emiline's idea, sketched out in one of her drawings the night before the final hearing. Stick figures standing before a large eye that watched everything, ensuring that truth couldn't be hidden or manipulated. In dark corners, where children's voices were typically silenced, what she couldn't have anticipated was how that simple concept would transform not just her own story, but the broader conversation about institutional accountability and children's rights. By 9 in the morning, Emi's voice was trending globally, with the courthouse feed being watched by over 2 million viewers across multiple platforms. Child welfare advocates, trauma specialists, and legal experts were providing real-time commentary that transformed the judicial proceeding into a masterclass on the intersection of justice, family dynamics, and institutional reform. Judge Thornfield, who had arrived expecting to process routine custody paperwork, found himself presiding over what was essentially a public trial of the systems that had failed Emiline so catastrophically. The cameras captured every nuance of his expressions as testimony revealed the scope of institutional corruption that had enabled her trauma. The fertility clinic network operated for 15 years without detection, Agent Chen testified with clinical precision, her words carrying the weight of federal investigation. 47 children were conceived through fraudulent genetic substitution, their families manipulated for intelligence purposes, and the medical institutions that enabled this conspiracy received federal funding for legitimate research programs. The CB implications rippled through the courtroom and across social media platforms, where viewers were processing the reality that American fertility treatments had been weaponized by foreign intelligence operations. But for Emiline, sitting quietly beside B in the front row, the larger geopolitical implications mattered less than the simple question of where she would sleep that night. Dr. Winters approached the witness stand with the authority of someone whose expertise had been earned through decades of working with traumatized children. Her testimony would either validate the healing that had occurred in the Calder household or recommend institutional intervention that could undo months of psychological progress. Emiline Vale has demonstrated remarkable resilience in her recovery, Dr. Winters began, her voice carrying to the live audience that extended far beyond the physical courtroom. But that resilience has been nurtured in a specific environment that provides security, communication support, and unconditional acceptance. Removing her from that environment would constitute what we call secondary trauma, harm inflicted by the systems intended to protect her. The prosecution, led by State Attorney Margaret Holbrook, attempted to argue that institutional placement would provide Emiline with access to specialized services and professional oversight that a family environment couldn't match. But their argument was undermined by the obvious reality of Emiline's visible improvement and her clear preference for remaining with the people who'd helped her heal. "Miss Vale," Holbrook said, addressing Emiline directly, "do you understand that there are special schools and programs designed specifically for children who've experienced trauma like yours? Places where other children would understand what you've been through?" Emiline's response required no translation. She stood and walked over to where B was sitting, taking her hand before beginning to sign with the kind of clear determination that had characterized all her public communications. "She says she already has someone who understands what she's been through," B translated, her 8-year-old voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom. "She says I understand because my mom died too. And Mr. Wes understands because he's sad about Mrs. Sarah, and Mr. Rowan understands because his wife got hurt by the same bad people." The simplicity of her logic was devastating to arguments about specialized institutional care. Emiline had found healing not through professional programs, but through genuine human connection with people who'd experienced their own losses and learned to create family structures based on choice rather than circumstance. Rowan Vale's testimony came next, and it represented a transformation that had been months in the making. Gone was the authoritative billionaire who'd demanded immediate custody. In his place stood a father who'd learned that love required listening more than commanding. "I veiled my daughter before she was kidnapped," he said, his voice carrying the weight of acknowledged responsibility. "I was so focused on protecting her from external threats that I missed the internal ones. The people I trusted to keep her safe were the ones planning to harm her. But Mr. Calder and his family didn't fail her. They listened when she tried to communicate. They believed her when she revealed the truth, and they loved her when she needed healing." His testimony continued with revelations that surprised even the federal investigators. "I've liquidated the Vale Foundation and transferred those assets to a new organization focused on supporting child witnesses and reforming fertility treatment oversight. Emiline taught me that wealth without wisdom is just another form of poverty." The courtroom stirred as viewers processed the implications of a billionaire philanthropist dismantling his life's work in response to lessons learned from a 7-year-old child. But Emiline's attention remained focused on simpler concerns, signing questions to B about when they could go home and whether they'd still have time for their afternoon reading practice. When Wes took the witness stand, his testimony carried The quiet authority of someone who'd never asked for the responsibility he'd accepted, but had risen to meet it through love rather than obligation. 3 months ago, I was a widowed mechanic trying to raise my daughter and honor my wife's memory, he said, his calloused hands folded carefully as he addressed Judge Thornfield and the global audience watching through their screens. I never planned to become anyone's foster father or to get involved in international conspiracies. But when a scared child needed help, my wife's teachings reminded me that family isn't about genetics. It's about who shows up when someone needs protection. His voice strengthened as he continued, drawing on reserves of conviction he'd discovered. Through the process of defending Emiline's right to choose her own family structure, Sarah used her dying months to create a network that would protect Emiline when the time came. She knew this child would need people who understood communication barriers, who'd experienced loss, and who'd choose love over convenience. Sarah picked us for this job, and Emiline confirmed that choice through her recovery. I'm not asking for custody because I think I'm the best option. I'm accepting custody because this child has made it clear that our family is where she feels safe. The global audience was witnessing something unprecedented, a custody hearing that had become a public examination of what constituted family, how institutions could support or harm vulnerable children, and whether traditional legal frameworks could accommodate the complex realities of modern family structures. Dr. Patricia Valdez, the court-appointed child psychologist who'd been brought in to provide independent assessment, delivered testimony that would ultimately determine Emiline's future. Traditional placement protocols assume that institutional care provides superior oversight and professional intervention, Dr. Valdez began, her words carrying the weight of 30 years' experience in child welfare. But Miss Vale's case demonstrates the limitations of that assumption. She's made more psychological progress in 3 months with the Calder family than many traumatized children achieve in years of institutional treatment. She paused to consult her notes, then continued with the kind of clinical precision that brooked no argument. The child has demonstrated clear preference for her current placement, articulated rational reasons for that preference, and shown measurable improvement in trauma symptoms, communication skills, and social integration. Most significantly, she's learned to trust adult authority figures again, a development that would be unlikely in institutional settings where staff rotation prevents the formation of stable attachment relationships. Judge Thornfield had been listening to this testimony with the concentrated attention of someone whose decision would be scrutinized not just by legal appeal processes, but by millions of people who'd watched a child's healing process unfold in real time. Dr. Valdez, he said carefully, what would be the psychological impact of removing Miss Vale from her current placement? Catastrophic, she replied without hesitation. This child has rebuilt her sense of safety around specific people and environments. Removal would be interpreted as another betrayal by adult authority figures, potentially triggering regression that could take years to overcome. The testimony phase concluded with Emiline herself requesting permission to address the court one final time. Judge Thornfield granted the request with visible reluctance, recognizing that denying a child's voice in proceedings about her own future would be indefensible given the global scrutiny. Emiline approached the witness table with the steady composure that had characterized her throughout the ordeal. She looked directly at the camera that was broadcasting her words to millions of viewers, then began signing with the clear intention of someone who'd found her voice and intended to use it for more than just her own protection. I want other kids like me to know that adults sometimes make bad choices, but that doesn't mean all adults are bad. B translated, her young voice carrying Emiline's message to audiences around the world. I want them to know that families can be made by people who choose to love you, not just people who are related to you by blood. She paused in her signing to look directly at Judge Thornfield, then continued with the kind of wisdom that transcended. age and legal complexity. The people who hurt my mum and tried to hurt me thought they could win because nobody would listen to a kid who couldn't talk. But my family taught me that there are lots of ways to tell the truth when people are willing to hear it. I hope other kids will remember that when they need help. The courtroom remained absolutely silent as Emiline concluded her statement, but the emotional impact of her words was visible in the faces of everyone present. She'd transformed her own trauma into a message of hope for other vulnerable children, demonstrating that healing was possible when love was given freely and voices were heard clearly. Judge Thornfield spent several minutes reviewing his notes while the global audience waited for a decision that would determine not just Emiline's future, but potentially influence family law and child welfare policy for years to come. When he finally looked up, his expression carried the weight of someone making a decision that would define his judicial legacy. This court has heard testimony that challenges fundamental assumptions about family structure, institutional care, and the rights of children to participate in decisions affecting their welfare. Judge Thornfield began, his words carrying to the packed courtroom and the millions watching through live broadcast. Miss Emiline Vale has demonstrated not only remarkable resilience in her recovery from systematic trauma, but wisdom that exceeds her chronological age. The judge paused, consulting his notes while the global audience held its collective breath. Outside the courthouse, protesters maintained their vigil with signs demanding justice and transparency. Inside, a 7-year-old girl sat quietly beside her chosen family, her hands folded in her lap as she waited to learn whether adult authority would support or undermine the healing she'd fought so hard to achieve. The evidence presented demonstrates that Miss Vale's current placement has facilitated extraordinary psychological recovery. Judge Thornfield continued, his voice strengthening with judicial conviction. Dr. Winters, Dr. Valdez, and Agent Chen have all testified that removing the child from her current environment would constitute secondary trauma that could undo months of healing. He turned to look directly at Emiline, who met his gaze with the steady composure that had characterized her throughout the proceedings. More significantly, Miss Vale herself has articulated clear, rational preferences about her placement that demonstrate understanding of her situation and wisdom about her own needs. This court cannot, in good conscience, ignore the voice of a child who has shown such courage in speaking truth to power. The courtroom began to stir with anticipation, but Judge Thornfield raised his hand for continued silence as he reached the crucial portion of his decision. Emergency custody will remain with Wes Calder with continued shared parental rights for Rowan Vale. This court finds that the current arrangement serves Miss Vale's best interests and that any disruption would be contrary to her demonstrated progress and clearly expressed preferences. The eruption of applause and cheering that followed was immediate and sustained, echoing through the courthouse and across social media platforms, where millions of viewers celebrated a decision that validated children's rights to participate in determining their own welfare. But Emiline's reaction was quieter and more profound. She simply reached over to take Wes's hand, while signing "Thank you" to Judge Thornfield with her free hand. Furthermore, the judge continued once order was restored, this court directs that Miss Vale's testimony and the evidence presented in this case be forwarded to appropriate federal authorities for investigation of systemic failures in child protection services and fertility treatment oversight. The conspiracy that enabled Miss Vale's trauma must be addressed at institutional levels to prevent similar harm to other children. Dr. Winters approached the bench with the family portrait that Emiline had drawn the previous evening. A simple but powerful image showing stick figures representing all the adults who'd become her protectors, connected by a web of hands that bridged any gaps between them. "Your Honor," Dr. Winters said, presenting the drawing, "Miss Vale asked me to give this to you as a thank you for listening to her voice. She said it shows how families can be bigger than houses when people choose to love each other. Judge Thornfield accepted the drawing with visible emotion, studying the child's artwork that had somehow captured the essence of family bonds that transcended traditional legal categories. The image showed not just the Calder and Vale families, but also Dr. Winters, Agent Chen, and even Sarah's memory, represented as a guardian angel watching over the connected figures. Please tell Miss Vale that her artwork will remind me why we have family courts, not to separate people who love each other, but to protect relationships that help children grow into the people they're meant to become. As the formal proceedings concluded, the broader implications of the case began to ripple through legal and social service communities. The live broadcast had created unprecedented public awareness of how institutional failures could compound individual trauma, while Emiline's testimony had demonstrated that children's voices, when properly supported, could provide insights that adult expertise sometimes missed. Agent Chen approached the family group with news that would provide closure to the investigative phase of their ordeal. Marcus Volkov has agreed to a plea bargain that includes full disclosure of the fertility clinic network and cooperation in identifying other affected families. The 46 other children who were conceived through fraudulent procedures will have access to the same support services that helped Emiline. Rodriguez added details that spoke to the broader impact of their courage in bringing the conspiracy to light. The fertility clinic network has been completely dismantled, with criminal charges filed against medical professionals and administrators in 12 states. Your willingness to go public prevented this system from claiming additional victims. But for Emiline, the most important news came from Rowan, who knelt beside her with the patient humility he'd learned through months of rebuilding their relationship. "Sweetheart," he said softly, "I've bought a house here in Cedar Falls, just a few blocks from Wes and B. Would you like to help me decorate it so you'll have your own room when you visit, but you'll still be close to your family here?" Emiline's response was to throw her arms around both her fathers simultaneously, creating the kind of three-way hug that symbolized the unconventional family structure they'd created through choice rather than genetics. When she pulled back, her hands moved in signs that needed no translation, pure joy and gratitude for adults who'd learned to prioritize her needs over their own convenience. The media circus that followed their exit from the courthouse was intense, but manageable, with Emiline demonstrating remarkable composure as she waved to supporters and signed brief messages for reporters who'd covered her story with sensitivity and accuracy. The girl who'd once hidden behind swing sets now stood confidently before cameras, having learned that truth-telling could be a form of protection when supported by people who loved her unconditionally. Dr. Winters conducted her final psychological evaluation that evening, documenting changes that would become part of the research literature on trauma recovery and family resilience. Emiline has progressed from selective mutism and hypervigilance to confident self-advocacy and secure attachment relationships, she noted in her report. The key factors in her recovery were consistent caregiving, communication support, and respect for her autonomy in making age-appropriate decisions about her care. Most significantly, Emiline had begun teaching sign language to other children in her elementary school class, transforming her own communication challenges into opportunities to help classmates learn new skills. Her teacher reported that she'd become a natural mediator for conflicts, using her hard-won wisdom about adult trustworthiness to help other children navigate social difficulties. The evening celebration at Wes's house was quiet but profound, with takeout pizza shared around the kitchen table that had become the command center for their fight against institutional indifference. Emiline presented each adult with drawings that captured their role in her recovery. Wes fixing both cars and hearts, Dr. Winters helping children find their voices, Agent Chen protecting families from bad people, and Rowan learning to listen with his heart instead of his wallet. But the most significant artwork was the self-portrait she'd created, showing herself not as a victim of trauma, but as a bridge between different worlds, connecting families created by choice, languages that transcended words, and healing that transformed suffering into strength. As bedtime approached, Emiline made a request that surprised everyone. She wanted to sleep in her own room rather than on the living room couch, where she'd felt safest during the most difficult weeks. The transition to her childhood bedroom represented more than just normal sleeping arrangements. It symbolized her recovery of the basic security that every child deserved. "Sweet dreams, Em," B said, as she tucked her friend into bed with the gentle authority of an older sister who'd helped heal trauma through unconditional acceptance. "Sweet dreams, little sister," Wes added, his voice thick with the emotion of someone who'd never planned to be a father to 2 children, but had discovered that love expanded to meet whatever demands were placed upon it. "Sweet dreams, my brave daughter," Rowan whispered, his words carrying 3 years of grief and guilt transformed into gratitude for the people who'd loved his child when he'd been too broken to do so effectively. As the adults gathered in the living room to process the day's events, they found themselves changed, not just by victory in court, but by the experience of witnessing a child's courage transform a tragedy into a triumph of human resilience over institutional failure. "She saved herself," Dr. Winters observed quietly. "We provided support and advocacy, but Emiline made the choices that led to her recovery. She chose to trust, to communicate, to hope, and ultimately to use her voice to protect other children from similar harm." Agent Chen added the perspective of someone whose work typically focused on punishment rather than healing. "I've seen hundreds of cases involving child victims, but I've never seen a child transform her own trauma into protection for others." Emiline didn't just survive. She became an advocate for systemic change. Outside, Cedar Falls had returned to its normal rhythms of small-town life, but inside one modest house, a family created by choice rather than genetics settled into routines that would carry them forward into a future none of them could have imagined 3 months earlier. The conspiracy that had tried to weaponize genetics against vulnerable families had been defeated not by superior resources or legal maneuvering, but by the simple power of people who'd chosen to love a child unconditionally and to listen when she found the courage to speak truth to power. Emiline's final drawing of the day showed a garden where different types of flowers grew together. In the same soil, their roots intertwined and their petals reaching toward shared sunlight. It was, her caretakers realized, the perfect metaphor for the family they'd grown together. Diverse in origin, but unified in their commitment to helping each other flourish regardless of the storms they'd weathered to reach this place of safety and love. 6 months later, the memory garden bloomed with the first flowers of spring, their colors as varied and resilient as the family that had planted them together. What had begun as a memorial to Sarah Calder had evolved into something larger, a living testament to the connections that could grow between people who chose to love across any barrier of loss, language, or circumstance. Emiline knelt beside the raised bed where they'd planted forget-me-nots, her small hands moving with the practiced confidence of someone who'd learned that growth required both patience and daily care. The girl who'd once hidden behind playground equipment now worked openly in full view of neighbors who'd come to understand that healing happened not in isolation, but in the presence of community that chose to protect rather than judge. The blue ones are blooming first, she signed to B, who was working on the section dedicated to herbs that would eventually supply their cooking experiments. Their communication had evolved beyond simple translation into a fluid conversation that mixed spoken words with sign language and the kind of intuitive understanding that developed between people who'd learned to trust each other completely. Wes emerged from the garage where he'd been working on Mrs. Henderson's ancient truck, his hands bearing the familiar stains of honest work that had become symbols of stability in their rebuilt life. The federal protection details had been withdrawn months ago, but the security of their daily routines had proven more durable than any external safeguards. "Rowan's bringing lunch," he announced, settling onto the garden bench they'd built together, from reclaimed wood, and Dr. Winters called to say the foundation paperwork is ready for your signature, Em. The Emiline Vale Foundation for Child Witnesses had been Emiline's idea, sketched out in one of her drawings as a way to help other children who'd experienced what she had endured. The foundation would provide sign language education, art therapy resources, and legal advocacy for child witnesses whose voices had been dismissed or ignored by adult systems that prioritize convenience over justice. Rowan's arrival brought the comfortable chaos of family lunch preparations, with takeout containers arranged around the picnic table they'd positioned to overlook both the memory garden and the playground equipment that Bea and Emiline used for daily recreation. The billionaire philanthropist who'd once commanded rooms full of executives now found his greatest satisfaction in the simple task of distributing sandwiches to people who loved his daughter without expectation of reward or recognition. The Taji Times wants to do a follow-up story about the fertility clinic prosecutions, he mentioned, as they settled into their meal, but they're specifically requesting that Emiline not be interviewed. They want to focus on the systemic changes that resulted from her courage, without re-traumatizing her through media exposure. Emiline looked up from her sandwich with the thoughtful expression that had become characteristic of her approach to decisions that might affect other vulnerable children. After a moment, she began signing with the deliberate precision of someone who'd learned that her words could influence events far beyond her immediate experience. She says she wants to write a letter that they can publish instead of doing interviews, Bea translated, her role as interpreter having evolved into something more like partnership in advocacy. She wants other kids to know that speaking up is scary, but that staying silent is scarier. Dr. Winters arrived as they were finishing lunch, bringing news that would mark another milestone in Emiline's journey from victim to advocate. The last of the fertility clinic operators was sentenced this morning, she announced with satisfaction. 15 years federal prison, with restitution payments going to support services for the 47 affected families. The conclusion of the prosecutions marked the end of their direct involvement in legal proceedings, but the beginning of their work to prevent similar conspiracies from claiming future victims. Emiline's testimony had prompted congressional hearings on fertility treatment oversight, resulting in legislation that would prevent the kind of systematic fraud that had enabled international criminal enterprises to exploit American families. More importantly, Dr. Winters continued, the research project based on your recovery process has been approved for funding. We'll be documenting how family-based care with communication support can achieve better outcomes than traditional institutional approaches for traumatized children. The afternoon was spent in the kind of activities that had become routine but never lost their significance. Homework completion at the kitchen table where so many crucial conversations had taken place, art therapy sessions that had evolved from trauma processing into creative expression, and the reading practice that had helped Emiline develop literacy skills in both English and sign language. As evening approached, they gathered in the living room for the weekly family meeting that had become their forum for discussing everything from household chores to major decisions about Emiline's continuing care and education. The democracy they'd established ensured that every voice was heard, every concern was addressed, and every choice was made collectively rather than imposed by adult authority. I've been thinking about Mrs. Sarah, Emiline signed, during the sharing portion of their meeting, her words carrying the kind of contemplative wisdom that never ceased to amaze the adults who'd watched her heal. I think she would be happy that we became a family that chose each other instead of just accepting what genetics gave us. Wes felt the familiar tightness in his chest that accompanied thoughts of Sarah, but it was no longer the sharp pain of fresh grief. Instead, it carried the bittersweet recognition that his wife's sacrifice had enabled healing that extended far beyond their immediate family to influence child welfare policy and criminal justice reform. Sarah would be proud of all of us, he replied, his hands moving in the sign language that had become as natural as breathing in their household. But she'd be especially proud of you for using your voice to protect other children who might need help finding theirs. B contributed her own observation with the insight that had characterized her adaptation to their expanded family structure. I think Mrs. Sarah knew that families work best when everybody gets to choose to stay, not when people have to stay because of rules or blood, or because adults say so. As bedtime routines began, Emiline made her way around the house, saying goodnight to each family member, with the kind of secure attachment that had seemed impossible during those first terrifying weeks when trust felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. Her recovery had progressed to the point where nightmares were rare, startled responses had diminished, and the hypervigilance that had once characterized her every interaction had been replaced by appropriate caution balanced with genuine openness to new experiences. Tomorrow, I want to teach the new girl at school some signs, she announced as Bee helped her prepare for bed. She just moved here, and she seems scared like I was scared. Maybe learning sign language will help her feel less alone. The observation reflected how completely Emiline had transformed her own experience of isolation into empathy for others who might be struggling with communication barriers or social integration challenges. Her recovery had not simply restored her to her previous functioning level, it had enabled growth that made her a source of strength for other vulnerable children. As the house settled into the quiet rhythms of evening, Wes found himself standing in the doorway of Emiline's bedroom, watching her sleep with the peaceful expression of someone who'd learned that safety was not just the absence of danger, but the presence of people who could be trusted to provide protection, understanding, and unconditional love. The journey that had begun with a frightened child hiding behind playground equipment had culminated in the creation of a family structure that challenged traditional assumptions about genetics, custody, and institutional care. More significantly, it had demonstrated that healing was possible even from the most systematic trauma when children were given voice, choice, and access to adults who prioritized listening over commanding. Dr. Winters had documented their success in research that would influence child welfare policy for decades. But the real measure of their achievement was simpler and more profound. A child who'd been systematically failed by every adult institution designed to protect her had learned to trust again, to communicate fearlessly, and to use her voice in service of others who needed advocacy and protection. The memory garden would continue to grow and change with the seasons, its flowers blooming and fading in cycles that mirrored the natural progression of grief, healing, and hope. But the love that had planted those flowers, chosen rather than inherited, nurtured through intention rather than obligation, would endure as testimony to the truth that families could be created through commitment rather than genetics, and that children's voices, when properly supported and protected, could change systems that had seemed immovable. In the quiet of Cedar Falls, where neighbors still waved from their porches and children still rode bicycles down tree-lined streets, a small girl slept peacefully in a house full of people who'd learned that communication was about so much more than words, that family was about so much more than blood, and that love was about so much more than convenience. The conspiracy that had tried to weaponize genetics against vulnerable families had been defeated by the simple power of people who'd chosen to listen when a child found the courage to tell the truth, and who'd responded with the kind of protection that enabled healing rather than demanding it. Sarah's legacy lived on, not just in the garden that bore her memory, but in the family that had grown from her sacrifice, in the legislation that bore Emiline's name, and in the countless other children who would benefit from the understanding that love transcended every barrier when people chose connection over convenience, truth over comfort, and healing over revenge. The story that had begun with loss had become a testament to the possibility of hope, and the girl who'd once been too frightened to trust had become a bridge between broken families and the possibility of redemption that existed when people chose to love beyond the boundaries of blood, law, or expectation.